Hello, my friend. Whatever brought you here tonight, I'm so glad you're here. So make yourself comfortable. Leave today's worries where they are, and let's spend a peaceful evening together exploring another corner of history. If these quiet journeys into the past have ever helped you relax or drift off to sleep, a like and a subscribe help this little channel find someone else who needs it too. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you might think. While you settle in, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Maybe a peaceful evening in Colorado, a quiet village somewhere in the Lake District, or a chilly winter night in Melbourne with a warm cup of tea nearby. Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. I really do read every single one. Now get comfortable. You don't have to do anything except listen. Just stay here with me. Comfortable? Good. Let us begin. It is the last evening of August, 1786, and the light through the tall windows of a rented house in Geneva has gone the colour of weak tea, the kind of late gold that makes everyone inside look faintly more flattering than they actually are. A trunk sits open on the floor, half packed, and a woman kneeling beside it is refolding a shawl for the third time, not because the folds were wrong, but because her hands need something to do. Her name is Margaret Ashworth. She is 34, and tomorrow morning, before the sun clears the ridgeline across the lake, she and her husband and their 2 children, along with a manservant and a lady's maid, will begin the part of their journey she has been quietly dreading and quietly longing for since they left England 14 months ago, the crossing of the Alps. Her husband, Edmund, sits at the writing desk, going over papers he's already gone over twice. Their son, Henry, 11 years old, has spent the better part of an hour at the window watching for mountains he insists, with total 11-year-old confidence, he can somehow already feel. Their daughter, Charlotte, 15, has said almost nothing all evening, which her mother has learned over 15 years is never a sign that nothing is happening inside her. Here is the thing that will not quite sit still in Margaret's mind tonight. They are, by any English measure, a fortunate family, comfortable income, a handsome paid-for house in Derbyshire, healthy children, loyal servants. And yet tomorrow all 4 of them will hand themselves over almost entirely to strangers. Their carriage will be taken apart by men whose names they do not know. Margaret herself will be carried, quite literally lifted off the ground, in a chair borne on shoulders she has never met, above drops she has been told not to look down into. Wealth, in England, means never being carried. Here, for the next several days, it will mean exactly that. Morning comes early, the house already full of small sounds, boots on stairs, trunks carried down to the waiting carriage. There is bread nobody quite finishes, a last small argument about a second trunk that Charlotte wins simply by saying nothing. And then they are moving, Geneva falling behind them, its lake catching the first light of the day, and ahead of them, for now, nothing but ordinary road. Henry sees the mountains first. Of course he does. He's been watching for them since before the carriage left the courtyard, and when they finally break through, pale and enormous above a fold of nearer hills, he does not so much announce them as simply go quiet, which for Henry is its own kind of shout. Margaret follows his gaze and feels something shift in her chest. Not fear exactly. Not yet, but a kind of recalibration, the sense a person gets when a thing they have only imagined suddenly has weight and distance and a colour of its own. A pale blue-grey that does not look quite real against the ordinary green of the valley. The road holds for longer than any of them expect. 2 hours, then 3, the wheels still turning on packed earth and gravel, the carriage still behaving like a carriage, and Margaret finds herself almost lulled by it, until the road simply stops being a road. Not dramatically. There is no sign, no gate. The track narrows, the surface roughens, and at a cluster of low stone buildings that turn out to be the last posting station before the true ascent, their driver reins in the horses and climbs down and says, in French too quick for Margaret to fully follow, something that Edmund translates a moment later with a small, resigned smile. This is as far as the carriage goes. From here, it comes apart. She had been told this would happen. She had read about it in a friend's letters, had heard it described second-hand at dinners in London by men who had made the tour a decade earlier and told the story afterward like a war anecdote. Knowing a thing and watching it happen in front of you turn out to be entirely different experiences. 3 men appear from the low buildings, unhurried, clearly expected, clearly practiced, and within minutes the carriage that has carried them from England through France along the shore of the lake is being taken apart like a puzzle designed for exactly this purpose. Wheels are pulled and wrapped in cloth. The body of the carriage, lightened, is strapped to the back of a mule so broad through the chest that Henry cannot stop staring at it. Axles are bundled separately, trunks are redistributed onto the backs of 3 more mules, and Margaret watches her own belongings, her clothes, her letters, the small portrait of her mother she brought from Derbyshire, wrapped in wool at the bottom of one case, disappear onto the back of an animal she does not know, led by a man whose name she has not yet learned. That is the moment, if you asked her later, that she would say the crossing truly began. Not the mountains coming into view, not the last road ending. The moment her possessions left her hands and went onto the back of a stranger's mule, and she understood, all at once, that for the next several days control was simply not going to be hers to hold. The man leading the lead mule introduces himself, through Edmund's imperfect French, as Jean-Baptiste, and he has the sort of face that has clearly spent every summer of its life outdoors, weathered in a way that makes him look both older and somehow more durable than most of the gentlemen back in Derbyshire. He has done this route, he says, since he was 14. He does not say it as a boast. He says it the way a man mentions the weather, a plain fact about his life that he has stopped finding remarkable, though it is, Margaret thinks, entirely remarkable to her. And here is a strange thing about the mountains once you're actually among their lower slopes rather than merely looking at them from a distance. They stop being a single object and become instead an enormous collection of very specific, very local decisions. Which path holds after last week's rain and which does not? Which mule is having a difficult day and should carry less? Which of the travellers, judging by how they sit a horse, or how they hold themselves getting down from a carriage, will need the chair sooner rather than later? Jean-Baptiste and the other guides make a dozen small judgments like this within the first half hour, none of them explained aloud, all of them apparently obvious to men who have spent their whole lives reading this particular stretch of ground, the way Edmund reads a ledger. The chairs themselves are brought out not long after the carriage has finished coming apart. They are simpler than Margaret expected. A wooden seat with a low back and armrests, mounted on 2 long poles that rest on the shoulders of the men who will carry them. 4 men to a chair, changing off in pairs so that no single set of shoulders bears the weight for too long at a stretch. Margaret watches one of the chairmen test the balance of an empty chair, shifting the poles slightly on his shoulder until the weight sits where he wants it, and she has a brief, almost dizzying thought. In a few minutes, that balance he's finding, that careful adjustment of weight, is going to be finding her. She had imagined, in the weeks of anticipating this, that getting into the chair would feel like an indignity, and instead it feels almost like nothing at all. A moment of odd domesticity in the middle of something enormous. A man steadying the chair with one hand and offering the other the way a footman might offer a hand down from a carriage in London. She settles onto the wooden seat, arranges her skirts, grips the low armrests more tightly than she intends to, and then the chair rises, smoothly, 4 men lifting in a coordination so practiced it does not even register as effort, and Margaret Ashworth is, for the first time in her life, moving forward on legs that are not her own. Charlotte goes up in the chair just behind her mother's, and Margaret twists slightly to see her daughter's face and finds, to her surprise, not fear there, but something closer to fierce concentration. The look Charlotte used to wear as a small child learning to swim, determined not to let the water see that it frightened her. Edmund and Henry walk, at least for now, alongside the chairs, on foot, because Edmund has decided, somewhat to Margaret's private amusement, that a gentleman ought to prove himself capable of the ascent before consenting to be carried, a resolve she privately suspects will not survive the first truly steep grade. The path itself, once they are properly on it, turns out to be nothing like the sheer cliff faces Margaret had half pictured. It winds, patient and considered, along the contour of the slope, rising gradually, doubling back on itself where the ground demands it, threading through stands of dark pine that smell, when the breeze moves through them, of resin and cold water and something else, something mineral that Margaret cannot quite name and eventually decides is simply the smell of altitude itself, air that has not passed through a city in longer than she can imagine. They are not alone on the path. That surprises her too somehow, though it should not, this being one of the few practical routes across an entire mountain range. Within the first hour they overtake, or are overtaken by, a string of other travellers moving at their own varied paces, and it is here, watching them, that Margaret begins to understand something about this crossing that no letter from a friend had quite prepared her for. It is not one experience. It is dozens of different experiences happening on the same narrow strip of ground at the same time. There is a merchant, for one, a solid, unhurried man in a plain brown coat, who overtakes their little procession on a sturdy horse, 2-pack mules following behind, laden with what Edmund later guesses from the shape of the crates might be bolts of cloth or crates of glassware bound for Turin. He nods to them as he passes, unbothered, entirely at home, a man who has clearly made this exact crossing so many times that the mountains have become, for him, simply the road between one warehouse and another. He does not stop to admire the view. He has seen it. He is thinking, Margaret suspects, about prices and delivery dates, and the state of the road ahead, the same practical calculations he would be making on any ordinary stretch of highway back in the lowlands. There is something almost comforting in watching him pass, this reminder that for some people this staggering landscape is simply Tuesday. Later, not long before the light begins to lean toward afternoon, they come upon a very different kind of traveller entirely. A young man walking, alone, a bundle over one shoulder tied with rope, boots that have clearly walked a great deal further than the distance from Geneva. He has no mule, no chair, no guide walking alongside him. He's making the crossing, Jean-Baptiste explains quietly to Edmund, the way a great many ordinary people make it, on his own 2 feet, carrying what he owns, sleeping wherever shelter presents itself, moving at whatever pace his body allows on a given day. He's not destitute exactly, his clothes are simple but sound, but he is a world away from the arrangement Margaret's family has paid for, and she finds herself looking at him, for rather longer than politeness strictly permits, struck by something she cannot quite put into words yet. He nods to them as he passes, the same unhurried nod the merchant gave, and continues on at his own steady walking pace, and within a few minutes he has vanished around a bend ahead of them, already gone, already somewhere else in his own private version of this same mountain. I find myself thinking, whenever I picture that young man, about how differently the same landscape can be experienced by different bodies and different purses. Margaret's family will be fed at inns along the way, carried when the ground grows steep, guided by men who know every fold of the train. He will do the entire crossing on legs and lungs and whatever bread he thought to buy before the road ran out. And yet, in a strange way, the mountain itself does not care about any of that. The cold at altitude will reach all of them the same. The thin air at the higher passes will make all of their hearts work harder, chairmen and merchants and gentry alike. There is a kind of levelling that happens up here that does not happen anywhere else on the entire Grand Tour, and Margaret, watching the young man disappear around the bend, feels the first faint edge of it. By mid-afternoon the trees have begun to thin, and the path, which had felt merely steep before, starts to feel genuinely ambitious, switching back on itself in tighter folds, the drop to one side growing more serious even as the chairman's pace remains, remarkably exactly the same. Unhurried, rhythmic, 4 men breathing in a kind of shared cadence that Margaret finds herself listening to almost like music. She had been warned not to look down, and for the first hour she obeyed that instruction with some discipline. But somewhere past the tree line curiosity wins out, and she looks, and what she finds is not the plunging terror she had braced for, but something closer to a held breath. Valleys folding away below them in green and grey, a thread of river catching the light so far down it looks less like water and more like a scratch someone made in the landscape with a fingernail. Edmund, walking, has gone rather quiet himself, and when Margaret catches his eye, he gives her a small, slightly rueful smile. The smile of a man whose resolve to walk the whole way is beginning to negotiate with his lungs. He does not ask to be carried, not yet, but she notices he has started timing his steps to match the chairmen's pace, as though borrowing their rhythm might borrow some of their endurance along with it. Henry, meanwhile, has attached himself almost entirely to one of the younger guides, a boy of perhaps 16 named Pierre, who is helping manage the mules, and has been peppering him with questions in a mixture of schoolroom French and enthusiastic gesturing for the better part of an hour. What do the mules eat up here? Has Pierre ever seen a wolf? What happens if it snows? Pierre answers what he can, laughs at what he cannot, and at one point simply hands Henry the lead rope of the gentlest mule and lets him walk it for a stretch, an act of casual trust that delights Henry more than almost anything else that has happened on the entire tour so far. 15 months of cathedrals and galleries and famous ruins, and it is a 16-year-old mule handler letting him hold a rope that has made him practically vibrate with pride. There is a particular sound, Margaret notices, that belongs entirely to this stretch of the journey and to no other part of the tour. The soft, irregular percussion of hooves on stone and packed earth, the creak of leather straps under load. Somewhere ahead, a bell, small and clear, tied around the neck of the lead mule, marking the position of the animal for the ones behind, and, she suspects, for any other traveller on the path who might hear it coming around a blind curve before they see it. And under all of it, wind, moving through the pines lower down and higher up, through nothing at all, simply moving across bare rock with a sound she has never heard before, thin and continuous and strangely soothing, like breath. The light is beginning to change, that particular gold that mountains seem to hoard until the very end of the day, and then spend all at once, when Jean-Baptiste points ahead to a cluster of low stone roofs tucked into a fold of the mountainside, smoke rising from at least 2 chimneys, and says something to Edmund that makes his shoulders visibly relax. The first village, a scatter of perhaps a dozen buildings, stone below and dark wood above, built low and solid against weather that Margaret suspects gets a great deal worse than anything they are experiencing today, with a single inn at its centre that has clearly been receiving travellers like them for longer than anyone currently living there can quite remember. Down in the small yard outside, the chairs are set with the same unhurried care they were lifted with, and Margaret finds her legs unsteady for a moment, not from any injury, but simply from the strangeness of being restored to her own 2 feet after hours of being carried, the ground feeling both solid and slightly unfamiliar beneath her, the way it does after a long sea crossing. Charlotte climbs out of her own chair with rather more grace, though Margaret notices her daughter's hand lingers on the chairman's arm a beat longer than strictly necessary for balance, a small thing, and Margaret decides not to have noticed it after all. Inside, the inn is dim and low-ceilinged and smells of wood smoke and something savoury simmering in a pot that nobody has bothered to identify yet, and the innkeeper, a broad, unhurried woman who Margaret guesses is in her 50s, greets Jean-Baptiste by name and greets the family with the practised, unfussy warmth of someone who has welcomed 1,000 travellers just like them and will welcome 1,000 more before her working life is done. There is a fire already going in the main room, and benches worn smooth by decades of use, and Margaret lowers herself onto one of them with something close to relief, her whole body finally registering, now that it is permitted to stop, exactly how far it has come today. That is the first day. 10 hours, give or take, from a rented house beside a lake to a stone inn tucked into the side of a mountain. And already, Margaret thinks, watching Henry describe the mule to his father in enormous and unnecessary detail, while Charlotte stares into the fire with an expression her mother cannot quite read. Already this feels like a different journey than any of the 14 months that came before it. The cathedrals and the galleries had been things they looked at. This, whatever this is becoming, is something they are inside of. Supper at the inn is not served the way supper is served at home, at a table set apart, family alone, courses arriving in careful sequence. Here there is one long room and one long table, and tonight nearly every kind of traveller the past produces, sitting at it together, because there is nowhere else for any of them to be. The merchant who passed them on the road is there, 3 tables down, eating with the brisk efficiency of a man who has eaten this exact meal in this exact room more times than he could count. The young man walking alone is there too, seated near the fire, and Margaret notices the innkeeper serves him the same stew, the same bread, without any visible distinction in portion or attention, though she also notices, a little later, that his coin for the meal is counted rather more carefully at the end than anyone else's, a small, practical honesty about who can and cannot afford to be generous with credit. It strikes Margaret watching all this, that back in England a gentry family and a solitary traveller with a bundle on his shoulder would almost never share a room, let alone a table, let alone a fire. Here, tonight, the mountain has simply made that arrangement for all of them, and nobody at the table seems to find it remarkable, which somehow makes it more remarkable to her, not less. Edmund falls into conversation with the merchant, mostly about roads and prices and the state of the pass further up, the kind of talk men make when they want to seem occupied rather than tired, and Margaret catches enough of it to gather that the merchant makes this crossing perhaps 6 times a year, has done for over a decade, and speaks of avalanche season and snow depth the way a farmer speaks of rainfall, a fact of his working life rather than a source of drama. Charlotte, meanwhile, has been drawn into a quieter conversation with one of the chairmen, a man perhaps 30 years old, with forearms that suggest exactly how he earns his living, who is explaining, patiently, in French simple enough for her schoolroom vocabulary to follow, how the teams rotate through the day so that no man carries the full weight for more than an hour or so at a stretch, how the chairs themselves are inspected each morning for any weakness in the poles, how a bad crossing, in his experience, comes far more often from a careless step than from any true danger in the mountain itself. Margaret watches her daughter listen to this with the kind of complete attention Charlotte rarely gives to anything at home, and feels something she cannot quite name, pride perhaps, or simply the pleasure of watching a child's world get larger in real time. There is a rule at this table, unspoken but somehow entirely clear to everyone in the room, that the fire and the food are shared regardless of who a person is or where they are headed, but that the sleeping arrangements afterward will sort themselves along much older, more familiar lines. The Ashworths are shown, once supper has finished, up a narrow stair to a room with 2 proper beds, small but private, while the merchant takes a bed in a shared room off the main hall, and the young walking traveller, along with 2 of the chairmen finishing their shift for the day, settle for the night on benches near the banked fire downstairs, where the warmth will linger longest. Nobody remarks on this. It is simply how the inn works, has worked, presumably for as long as travellers have been crossing this particular stretch of mountain, wealth buying privacy but not, tonight at least, buying any better company at the table. Margaret lies awake longer than she expects to, listening to sounds she has never slept beside before, the particular quiet of a mountain at night, which is not silence at all, but 100 small sounds arranged so differently from an English house that her ears keep startling at each one, a distant animal call she cannot place, the settling creak of old timber cooling after the day's warmth, once very faintly what might be bells from a mule tethered somewhere in the yard below, shifting its weight in its sleep. Edmund is already breathing the slow, even breath of genuine exhaustion beside her. Down the hall, she can hear nothing from the children's small room, which she chooses to interpret as sleep rather than worry over. She thinks, in that particular drifting way thoughts move just before sleep finally takes a person, about the young man by the fire downstairs, and about how strange it is that his day and her day were, in every practical sense, the same distance, the same mountain, the same weather, and yet utterly different journeys. She thinks about the chairman's forearms, and the careful way the innkeeper counted the young man's coin, and the merchant's unbothered efficiency, and somewhere in the middle of thinking all of this, without quite noticing the moment it happens, Margaret Ashworth falls asleep in a stone inn on the side of a mountain, further from home than she has ever been in her life, and sleeps more soundly than she has in weeks. Morning on the mountain arrives differently than morning anywhere else Margaret has known. There is no gradual grey easing into gold. There is dark, and then, quite suddenly, a line of brilliant white fire along the eastern ridge, sunlight catching a snowfield high above them before it has reached the valley floor at all, so that for a strange suspended few minutes the peaks are blazing, while the inn-yard below remains in shadow, as though the day were arriving from the top down rather than the bottom up. Henry is awake before anyone, of course, already outside in the cold with his coat only half fastened, watching that line of light creep down the mountainside with an expression of such total absorption that Margaret does not have the heart to call him in for breakfast just yet. The second day's climb is a different animal from the first. The trees have thinned to nothing now, replaced by bare rock and long slopes of scree, loose stone that shifts faintly underfoot even on the packed path, and the air itself has changed in a way Margaret was not entirely prepared for, thinner, colder, carrying less warmth even where the sun falls directly on it. Edmund, who managed to walk the whole of yesterday's climb, accepts a chair this morning without a word of protest, and Margaret decides, with some private amusement, not to mention it. They pass, not long after setting out, a group of perhaps 6 travellers coming the other way, descending from Italy toward Geneva, and there is a brief, oddly formal exchange of nods and a few called greetings in a mixture of languages before the two parties continue on in opposite directions, each carrying news of the road ahead for the other, a small practical courtesy that John Baptiste translates for Edmund as they pass. Snow higher up, apparently, more than usual for this time of year, though nothing that would close the pass, a bridge repaired since last month, a hospice further along that has taken in an unusually large number of travellers this week, owing to a spell of poor weather that broke only yesterday. That word, hospice, catches in Margaret's mind and stays there for the next several hours of climbing, curiosity working at her the way it does at Henry, though with rather more restraint. She has read the word before in accounts of the tour written by other English women, but reading a word and understanding what it actually means at 7,000 feet of elevation, in a landscape with almost nothing else in it, turn out to be different things entirely. The path steepens further as the morning wears on, switching back so tightly in places that Margaret, from the vantage of her chair, can look almost directly down onto the same stretch of ground the chairmen crossed only minutes before, laid out below them like a ribbon someone has dropped and not bothered to straighten. The chairman's breathing has changed too, she notices, shorter, more deliberate, though their pace is not slowed by any measure she can detect, a discipline that impresses her more the longer she watches it. At one particularly narrow stretch, where the path runs close along an edge with nothing beyond it but air, and far below, a valley gone hazy with distance, the lead chairman calls something back to the men behind him, a single short word, and all 4 adjust their step in perfect unison without breaking stride. A small, unremarkable act of coordination that Margaret suspects has been practiced across thousands of crossings by thousands of men whose names never appear in any account of the Grand Tour at all. She finds herself thinking about that, about how much of this entire journey, the journey her family will describe for years afterward at dinners in Derbyshire, the crossing of the Alps, capital letters implied, depends entirely on the unremarked skill of men whose individual names will likely never be written down anywhere, Jean-Baptiste and Pierre, and the chairmen whose names she has not yet learned, all of them essential, all of them invisible in the way that skilled, unglamorous labour so often is. It is not a comfortable thought exactly. It sits with her the rest of the morning, without resolving into anything tidy. The hospice appears not as a single dramatic reveal, but the way most things in the mountains seem to appear, gradually, a shape resolving out of grey stone that has clearly been chosen precisely because it does not stand out, low and thick-walled and built into the shelter of a rise, so that the worst of the wind passes over it rather than through it. It is larger than the village inn from the night before, and considerably plainer, no painted sign, no cheerful yard, just a heavy wooden door and smoke, rising steady and thin from a chimney built to withstand weather that Margaret suspects would flatten most English chimneys within a season. 3 monks are visible today, though Jean-Baptiste mentions there are usually more, and they greet arriving travellers with an unhurried efficiency that has clearly been refined over generations of exactly this task, taking in whoever the mountain sends them, regardless of purse or nation or purpose, and asking, as far as Margaret can tell, remarkably little in return beyond what a traveller can comfortably give. One of them, an older man with the weathered, permanently wind-burned look of someone who has spent decades at this altitude, leads them through to a long room warmed by a fire built high enough to be genuinely serious about its job, and Margaret feels her shoulders drop several inches the moment the heat reaches her. There are already other travellers here. A family somewhat larger and considerably louder than her own, Genevan by the sound of their French, and two men she takes for scholars, deep in quiet conversation over a shared book at the far end of the room, and, to her genuine surprise, the young man from the road, the one walking alone, seated near enough to the fire to warm his hands but not so near as to take up more of it than he judges his fair share. He nods to her, the same easy acknowledgement as before, and returns his attention to a heel of bread he has broken into smaller and smaller pieces, apparently making it last. The monks, Jean-Baptiste explains over the meal that follows, a plain and generous soup that Margaret finds she is more grateful for than any dinner she has eaten in 14 months of touring. Keep a kind of standing account of every traveller who passes through in bad weather, a practical record rather than a sentimental one, because in a hard winter, knowing who set out and did not arrive matters a great deal. He does not dwell on this. He mentions it the way he mentions the state of a bridge, or the depth of last week's snow, a plain fact of the work, and Margaret only realizes some minutes later how much weight that plain fact was quietly carrying. It is here, in the warm dim of the hospice that evening, that something shifts in Charlotte. Margaret notices it without quite being able to name the moment it happens. Her daughter has grown steadily more animated since yesterday's supper at the inn, and tonight, seated near enough to overhear the two scholars discussing something in Latin she cannot follow but is clearly straining to, Charlotte asks, quite suddenly and to nobody in particular, whether it is true that women are permitted to study such things properly at some of the universities on the continent, the way she has heard they cannot in England. One of the scholars, an older gentleman with kind, tired eyes, answers her seriously at some length, and Margaret watches her 15-year-old daughter's face do something she has not seen it do in the entire 14 months of this tour, come fully, unguardedly alive. Later, once the children have finally been persuaded towards sleep in a small side room set aside for families, Margaret steps out alone for a few minutes into the cold beside the hospice door, telling Edmund only that she wants air, which is true, though not the whole truth. What she wants, really, is a moment entirely her own, something she has had almost none of in 14 months of shared carriages and shared dinners and a constantly present household. The night outside is astonishing in a way she was not prepared for. No moon yet, but stars in a density and clarity she has genuinely never seen before, not in Derbyshire, not anywhere. The thin high air doing something to the light that makes the whole sky feel closer, almost touchable, and the cold is sharp enough to make her breath visible even in the dark. She stands there longer than she means to. She thinks unexpectedly, not of Edmund or the children, but of her own mother, dead 6 years now, and of the small portrait wrapped in wool somewhere on the back of a mule in a shed attached to this same hospice, and she finds herself crying, quietly, without any real sadness attached to it, the way tears sometimes arrive simply because a body has been carrying something for a very long time and the mountain air has, for reasons she cannot explain, finally let it go. Nobody sees her. She would not have minded particularly if they had. After a few minutes she wipes her face with the edge of her sleeve, looks up once more at that impossible density of stars, and goes back inside to the warmth and the sound of her family breathing. Sleep at the hospice comes heavy and dreamless, the kind of sleep that only real exhaustion produces, and Margaret wakes to the sound of one of the monks moving quietly through the long room before dawn, feeding the fire, and to the particular silence of a building with very thick walls, a silence that swallows sound rather than simply lacking it. Breakfast is bread and a hard, sharp cheese, and something warm and herbal that nobody quite identifies, and then they are outside again, into a cold that has sharpened further overnight, their breath standing in the air in front of them like something solid. Today, Jean-Baptiste tells them, through Edmund, they will reach the highest point of the crossing, and something in the way he says it, matter of fact but with a small note of ceremony underneath, makes even Henry go quiet for a stretch. The path this morning climbs through a landscape that has stopped resembling anything Margaret has ever walked through before. Bare rock in shades of grey and rust, patches of old snow lying in the shadowed folds even now, in the last days of August, snow that Jean-Baptiste says never fully melts up here, not even in the warmest summer. A fact that Henry finds so thrilling he insists on being set down from his own small chair to touch it with his bare hand, which he then holds up to show everyone, delighted as though he has personally discovered something. The air at this height does something strange to sound. Margaret notices it without quite being able to describe it properly, a kind of thinness to every noise, the chairmen's voices when they call to one another carrying oddly far and yet somehow flattened, and beneath everything always that same continuous low sound of wind across bare stone that she first heard yesterday and has not stopped hearing since, though she has mostly stopped noticing it now, the way a person stops hearing a clock they have lived beside long enough. Sometimes the chairmen sing, not loudly, not performing for anyone, simply the way people sing when a task has a rhythm that wants filling, and Margaret finds she likes it more than almost any music she has heard in a proper concert room, unpolished and irregular and entirely for its own sake. One of them, a broad, cheerful man everyone seems to simply call Mark, has a running joke with Pierre about the weight of Edmund's remaining trunk that Margaret only half follows in translation, but that has both men laughing steadily enough to make Henry demand, twice, to know what is so funny, a question nobody quite manages to answer to his satisfaction. They meet almost no one today. The pass at its highest stretch feels, for a long stretch of late morning, entirely their own, just the family and their small train of guides and mules moving through a landscape that seems indifferent to their presence in a way Margaret finds strangely restful rather than frightening, the mountains simply being what they are, ancient and enormous and entirely unbothered by an English family from Derbyshire passing through. Once, far off, they see movement on a distant slope that Jean-Baptiste identifies, after a squint, as chamois, wild goats that live at heights Margaret cannot imagine choosing to live at, and Henry watches them through cupped hands until they vanish behind an outcrop, already composing, she suspects, the version of this story he will tell his cousins. Then, quite suddenly, without any obvious signal beyond a slight change in Jean-Baptiste's posture, they crest something, not a peak exactly, more a long saddle of ground between two higher points, and the world on the far side opens in a way that makes even Edmund stop walking for a moment. Ahead of them, and considerably below, the land begins its long fall toward Italy, visible now in hazy layers of blue and green stretching further than Margaret's eye can properly resolve, and somewhere far down in that haze, though she cannot yet make out any detail, lies the plain that will eventually lead them to Turin. This is the top. This is the line, invisible on the ground but entirely real in every other sense, where the water they have been walking beside all morning stops flowing north toward the lake they left 2 days ago, and begins, somewhere just ahead of them, flowing south instead, toward a different sea entirely. Nobody says anything grand about it. That is what stays with Margaret afterward, oddly, more than the view itself. Nobody making a speech about it. Jean-Baptiste simply allowed them a few minutes to stand and look before nodding toward the downward path with the same unhurried practicality he has shown since the first morning. The mountain did not need announcing. It simply was, enormous and quiet and entirely unconcerned with whether a family from Derbyshire found the words to describe it, and Margaret, standing at the top of the only physical barrier she has ever crossed in her life, finds she does not much mind the silence either. Some things, she is beginning to understand, are better left unsaid than said badly. Going down turns out to require a different kind of trust than going up. Margaret notices this within the first quarter hour of the descent. The chairman's steps shorter now, more deliberate, weight braced backward against the pull of gravity rather than forward against the climb, and she finds her hands gripping the low armrests again. Not from any real fear, but simply from the novel sensation of being carried downhill, which her body, for reasons she cannot quite articulate, trusts rather less than being carried up. Charlotte, ahead of her, seems entirely unbothered, and Margaret decides, not for the first time on this journey, that her daughter may simply be braver than she is, a thought that arrives with more pride than sting. Not an hour into the descent, a rider comes up the path toward them, at a pace that seems almost reckless given the ground. A single man on a wiry, sure-footed horse, moving with the particular unhurried urgency of someone whose job is speed rather than comfort, and Jean-Baptiste steps well clear of the path to let him pass, murmuring something to Edmund that translates roughly to courier. The man barely glances at them as he goes by, entirely focused on the ground ahead of his horse's feet, some letter or dispatch riding in the bag behind his saddle bound for Geneva or beyond, and he has gone around the bend within seconds, leaving behind him a small, startled silence, and oddly, the smell of horse sweat lingering in the cold air for a moment before the wind takes that too. It strikes Margaret, watching him vanish, that this same stretch of mountain that has taken her family 2 full days to cross, slowly, deliberately, with rests and meals and an entire night's sleep at a hospice, is for that rider simply a stage in an ordinary working journey, to be covered as fast as the horse and his own skill allow, no different in his mind, probably, from any other difficult stretch of road he has crossed 100 times before in the course of carrying other people's urgent business. The mountain holds all of these different paces at once, she is realizing, the tourist's slow wonder and the merchant's steady practicality and the courier's flat-out urgency, layered over the same ground, none of them quite aware of how differently the others are experiencing the exact same rock and snow and thin air. The descent brings changes she had not fully anticipated, the bare grey rock of the highest ground giving way, gradually, to hardier grasses, then to low scrub, then, by early afternoon, to actual trees again, though different from the dark pines of the Swiss side, broader-leaved, a warmer green, and Jean-Baptiste names them for Edmund as chestnuts, the first sign, he says, of the milder country ahead, a tree that would not survive at the altitude they crossed only hours ago. Henry insists on collecting a handful of the spiky green husks scattered along the path, ignoring his mother's warning about the thorns until he has proven her right on his own fingers, at which point he abandons the project with the swift, undramatic acceptance children apply to their own small failures and moves on to something else entirely within minutes. A sound of water grows louder as the afternoon wears on, a waterfall somewhere off to their right that they can hear a full quarter-hour before the path bends enough to reveal it, a thin white ribbon dropping a considerable distance down a face of dark rock, into a pool Margaret cannot see but can hear, a deep continuous roar that makes conversation briefly impossible as they pass close beneath it, cold spray drifting across the path in a fine mist that leaves everyone's face damp and, Margaret thinks, oddly refreshed after hours of dry mountain air. Pierre grins at Henry through the spray, and Henry, delighted, tips his face directly into it, earning himself a scolding from his mother that neither of them takes very seriously. By late afternoon they reach a second village, smaller than the first, the architecture already subtly different, the stone lighter in colour, the roofs pitched at a slightly gentler angle, small practical signs, Jean-Baptiste explains, of a place with rather less snow to shed each winter than the villages higher up. The language has shifted too, French giving way in places to something that sounds, to Margaret's untrained ear, closer to Italian, though the innkeeper here, a wiry, quick-moving man with an enormous moustache, manages a passable French for their benefit and greets Jean-Baptiste, once again, like an old friend rather than a passing customer, which by now Margaret understands he essentially is. This same route walked and carried and negotiated dozens of times a year, every innkeeper and every chairman part of a working world that exists entirely independent of whichever English family happens to be passing through it this particular week. Supper here tastes different, and Margaret notices the difference before she can quite name its source. Something in the oil used rather than butter, a sharper, greener flavour she is not accustomed to, and a wine poured without much ceremony that Edmund pronounces, after careful consideration, rather good, better by far than anything they were served at the inn 2 nights ago. There is bread again, always bread, but denser this time, chewier, torn rather than sliced, and a dish of white beans cooked slow with herbs that Henry, to his mother's mild astonishment, eats an entire bowl of without complaint, a boy who back in Derbyshire can be persuaded to eat beans only under considerable duress. The room is smaller and louder than the one at the first inn, fuller too, packed with travellers moving in both directions across the pass, and Margaret catches fragments of at least 4 languages at once, French and Italian and something she thinks might be German and, once unmistakably, English, from a small group of young men seated near the far wall, who turn out, once Edmund makes their acquaintance over the wine, to be 3 students making their own version of the tour, considerably less encumbered than the Ashworths, travelling with a single manservant between the 3 of them and, from the state of their boots, a good deal more time spent walking than being carried. They are cheerful company, these 3, full of opinions about paintings they have seen and paintings they intend to see, and one of them, a lanky young man named Mr. Pierce, who cannot be much past 20, tells a long and clearly well-rehearsed story about a mule that refused to move on the far side of the pass 2 summers ago, until someone thought to sing to it. A story that has Henry laughing so hard he nearly falls off his bench, and that Margaret privately suspects has grown considerably in the telling since it first happened, the way all good travel stories do. Edmund and Mr. Pierce fall into an easy conversation about Turin, about which paintings are worth the long carriage ride to see, and which are, in Mr. Pierce's frank opinion, not worth the candle, and Margaret finds herself relaxing into the noise of the room in a way she has not managed since the tour began. The strange comfort of being surrounded by strangers who are, this evening at least, not really strangers at all. Charlotte, for her part, has grown quietly friendly with the innkeeper's daughter, a girl of perhaps her own age who speaks no English and very little French, but who has, through some combination of gesture and patience and the universal language of 2 girls comparing the plaits in each other's hair, managed to conduct what looks to Margaret like a genuinely warm conversation entirely without shared words. It is a small thing watching them, but it stays with Margaret longer than the wine or the beans or even Mr. Pierce's mule story, this evidence that some kinds of connection simply do not require the vocabulary a person thinks they need. Later, once the children have finally been persuaded upstairs and the noise of the main room has thinned to a low, contented murmur, Edmund and Margaret sit a while longer near the fire, not talking much, the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who have been married 14 years and do not need every minute filled. Edmund mentions, eventually, almost offhand, that he had not expected the crossing to feel like this, and when Margaret asks him what he had expected instead, he considers the question for a long moment before admitting he is not entirely sure, something grander perhaps, something more like the paintings, and instead what he has found is chairmen singing and a boy leading a mule and beans cooked with herbs and a courier passing at a dead run, none of it grand exactly, all of it, somehow, more than he had bargained for. Margaret does not say much in response. She simply reaches over and takes his hand for a moment, the way she has not really done since somewhere around Lyon, 3 months and 1 long stretch of ordinary road ago, and Edmund, a little surprised, closes his fingers around hers, and they sit like that for a while, watching the fire, listening to the last of the room's conversation fade towards sleep. 2 people a very long way from Derbyshire who have, without quite planning to, found something on this mountain that 14 months of cathedrals had not quite managed to give them. I want to pause the family's story here for just a moment, not to leave them, they are only a floor above us now, sleeping, but to sit with something wider for a little while, the way the fire in that inn might sit a little longer in the grate before finally going out. Crossings like this one were not new in 1786. People had been finding ways over these particular mountains for longer than anyone in that inn could have told you with any real precision. Traders and soldiers and pilgrims and, long before any of them, simply people who needed to get from one side to the other for reasons no record ever bothered to preserve. The Romans built roads through passes not far from the one the Ashworths crossed, roads whose stones in places were still visible in the 1700s, worn smooth by cartwheels that stopped rolling over 1,000 years before Margaret Ashworth was born. What had changed by the 1780s, and what made a crossing like this one possible for a family like the Ashworths, was less the mountain itself than the system built up around it. Generations of guides and chairmen and innkeepers and monks, an entire working economy that existed for the sole purpose of getting travellers, of every kind and every purse, safely from one side to the other. It was not formally organised in any way a modern person would recognise, no company, no office, no printed schedule. It worked instead the way a great many things worked before modern administration existed, through reputation, through family trades passed down father to son, through a shared unspoken understanding among the men who did this work that a traveller delivered safely was worth more, in the long run, than a traveller rushed or short-changed. The chairs themselves, the sedan chairs Margaret and Charlotte were carried in, were not a new invention by the time of their crossing. Travellers had been carried across various alpine passes this way for at least a century before, the practice growing more organised as the tour itself grew more fashionable among wealthy English families through the middle of the 1700s. A gentleman's guidebook of the period, the kind Edmund carried folded into his coat pocket, might casually mention the going rate for a chair and 4 bearers the way a modern traveller might mention the price of a train ticket. A practical detail among practical details, cathedral admission, currency exchange, the cost of being carried over a mountain. Sit with this for a moment. How much labour a single family's comfortable crossing actually required. 4 men to a chair, changing in pairs, for each member of the family who chose to ride rather than walk. Mule handlers for every animal carrying luggage or the disassembled carriage. Guides who knew the specific conditions of that week's snow and rock. Innkeepers stocking food and fuel for a season's worth of unpredictable arrivals. A single family's 2 or 3 days on the mountain rested on the coordinated skill of what might be a dozen or more working men, most of whom the family would forget within a year, and whose names, in the vast majority of cases, appear nowhere in any surviving letter or journal from the period at all. History, as it is usually written, remembers the Ashworths, or families very much like them. It does not much remember Jean-Baptiste, or Pierre, or the broad cheerful man called Mark. I find that worth noticing, not as an accusation against anyone. The Ashworths were not unusual, they were simply typical of their moment and their class, but as a small correction to the shape of the story as it usually gets told. The crossing of the Alps as an achievement, as a thing people did and later wrote home about, belonged just as much, arguably more, to the men who carried the chairs and led the mules and kept the hospice fires burning through the worst of the winter storms, men who made this exact crossing not once, as a memorable event to be recorded in a journal, but dozens of times a season, year after year, as simply the shape of their working life. Morning of the 3rd day begins gently, none of the sharp cold urgency of the 2 mornings before it, the air already noticeably milder even before the sun has properly cleared the ridge, and Margaret wakes to the sound, entirely new to this journey, of bird-song, ordinary and cheerful, the kind she has not really heard since somewhere below the tree line 2 days ago. The innkeeper's daughter brings up warm water for washing without being asked, and Charlotte, dressing beside her mother, mentions, with studied casualness that does not entirely disguise her pleasure, that the girl taught her 3 words of Italian last night before bed: good morning, thank you, and, for reasons neither of them can quite explain, the word for mule. The path today is gentler by every measure, wider in places, worn smoother by centuries of use, and Jean-Baptiste mentions, almost in passing, that by tomorrow the family will not need chairs at all, that the road ahead will be decent enough for a hired carriage to manage once they reach the next proper town. A piece of news that Margaret receives with an odd mixture of relief and, unexpectedly, a small pang of something like regret, as though the chairs, uncomfortable and strange as they had felt at first, had become in only 2 days a kind of familiar company she was not quite ready to give up. Chestnut groves give way in places to something Margaret recognises with real delight. The first vineyards of the trip, rows of vines climbing low terraced slopes in a pattern that speaks of generations of careful, patient labour, the leaves already turning at the edges with the first hint of autumn, though the grapes themselves, small and dark, still cling heavy to the vines. Pierre plucks a small bunch from a vine that runs close along the path, entirely without ceremony, and offers them around, and Henry declares them the best thing he has eaten on the entire tour, a verdict Margaret suspects has more to do with the pleasure of eating something plucked directly from a living plant than any real superiority in the fruit itself. By mid-morning the path has widened enough that Edmund and the children walk more often than they ride, and the group's pace settles into something almost leisurely, punctuated by Henry's frequent stops to examine a beetle or a strangely shaped rock or, once, a small green lizard that he pursues with total dedication for a full 10 minutes before it vanishes into a stone wall and he is forced, with visible reluctance, to abandon the chase. Charlotte walks mostly beside her father today, and Margaret, watching them from a little behind, catches fragments of a conversation about the university the scholar mentioned last night. Edmund's answers careful and honest, in a way that makes Margaret's chest tighten a little with something like hope that her husband might actually take his daughter's curiosity seriously rather than simply indulging it the way he might indulge a passing fancy. The first true view of the Italian plain comes just past midday, and it arrives the way the best views on this whole journey seem to, without warning, the path curving around a shoulder of hillside and simply opening onto it a vast pale haze of distance stretching south further than Margaret's eye can resolve into anything specific, farmland and scattered towns and, somewhere far off, though she cannot be entirely certain, what might be the faint suggestion of a river catching the early afternoon light. Jean-Baptiste names a few of the more distant features for Edmund's benefit, but Margaret finds herself only half listening, caught instead by the simple, overwhelming fact of it, that this hazy, sunlit country ahead of them is not England, has never once resembled England, and that in a day, perhaps two, they will be walking through it as ordinary travellers, rather than mountain crossers, the whole strange, carried, mule-bound chapter of the journey folding quietly closed behind them. They reach the day's destination, a proper town now rather than a village, in the last hour of good light, and the change is immediate and almost disorienting after 2 days of mounting quiet, streets with actual paving, houses stacked 3 and 4 stories, rather than the low stone huddle of the hospice and the 2 inns before it, and noise, real noise, cartwheels and voices, and somewhere, faintly, a bell marking some hour or some service Margaret cannot identify. There is a market still winding down in the main square as they arrive, stalls being packed away, but enough remaining that Margaret catches the smell of it before she sees it properly, something warm and yeasty from a bread stall, the sharper tang of cheese, and beneath all of it, the particular smell of a place that has been full of people and animals and produced since early morning, dust and sweat and fruit gone slightly overripe in the day's warmth. Henry is fascinated by everything at once, the way only a boy of 11 can be, and drags his father toward a stall still selling small carved wooden animals, mules mostly, unsurprisingly, and returns triumphant a few minutes later with one clutched in his fist, a tiny mule no larger than his thumb that Margaret suspects will be found, years from now, tucked into some forgotten drawer in Derbyshire, still carrying whatever memory of this particular afternoon it manages to hold on to. Charlotte lingers longer at a stall of ribbons and small fabric goods, though she buys nothing, simply runs her fingers along a length of deep red silk with an expression Margaret recognizes from her own younger self, the particular pleasure of wanting something not for any practical reason, but simply because it is beautiful and briefly within reach. Their lodging tonight is a proper inn rather than a mountain refuge, larger, somewhat grander, with a separate dining room and actual glass in the windows, and a fire that does not need to work quite so hard against the cold, since the evening air here, even now, carries a mildness that feels almost indulgent after 2 nights higher up. Margaret is shown to a room with a proper washstand, and she stands there longer than strictly necessary after the family has gone down to supper, simply looking at herself in a small, slightly cloudy mirror, noting the colour the last 2 days have put into her face, a healthy sunburnt flush along her cheekbones and the bridge of her nose that no amount of careful bonnet management fully prevented, and thinking that she looks, for the first time in 14 months of touring, genuinely well rather than merely rested. The washing itself, once she gets to it properly after supper, becomes its own small ceremony, warm water carried up by a servant girl and poured into the basin, the particular relief of finally removing 2 days of dust and mountain air from her skin, working a cloth over her arms and throat with an attention she rarely gives the task at home, where washing is simply a thing that happens rather than a thing she notices happening. Her feet, when she finally sits to tend them, are sore in a way that surprises her a little, given how much of the last 2 days she spent being carried rather than walking. A soreness she suspects belongs less to any particular exertion and more to the simple accumulated strangeness of 2 days spent almost entirely off level, familiar ground. She rubs a little of the scented oil Edmund's mother pressed on her before they left England into the arch of each foot, an indulgence she has not bothered with since somewhere around Lyon, and feels, by the time she finally climbs into a proper bed with proper linen, more thoroughly, satisfyingly tired than she can remember feeling in years. There is a particular quality to a small Italian town settling into night that Margaret has not encountered anywhere else on the tour, a gradual softening rather than a hard stop, voices continuing low in the square long after the market stalls have gone, someone somewhere playing a few notes on an instrument she cannot identify, plucked and bright, before giving it up, a dog barking twice at nothing in particular and then subsiding. She lies in bed listening to it drift up through the window she has left cracked open against the mild evening warmth, and finds it more soothing than troubling, this evidence of a whole town continuing its ordinary evening business, entirely indifferent to the passage of an English family through it today, gone again by tomorrow noon. Edmund, beside her, is already writing by candlelight when she turns to look at him, a letter, she assumes, to his brother back in Derbyshire, the kind of letter that will take another 2 months at least to arrive, and will describe, she suspects, a version of the crossing already smoothed and simplified in the telling, the discomfort softened, the wonder emphasized, the way all travellers' letters home tend to shape an experience into something more presentable than the messy, tiring, occasionally frightening reality of living through it. She does not mind this. She has written such letters herself to her sister, describing Rome in terms rather grander than she actually felt standing in front of any particular ruin, tired and hot and slightly disappointed that it did not move her the way the guidebooks promised it would. A letter is not a diary. It is a small gift a person sends ahead of themselves, and Margaret understands, watching Edmund's candle gutter slightly in the draught from the window, that gifts are allowed to be a little more polished than the truth. She thinks, drifting towards sleep, about the letter she might write herself, once there is time, to her sister in Bath, and finds herself composing fragments of it without quite meaning to, the way a mind left to its own devices in the dark often does. She will mention the chairs, she decides, and the singing, and the astonishing density of stars above the hospice, though she is not sure she will mention crying quietly by herself in the cold outside that same hospice, not because it embarrasses her exactly, but because some things, she is beginning to understand, are meant to be kept rather than sent, small private weights a person simply carries forward rather than setting down into a letter for someone else to hold. Rain arrives sometime before dawn, gentle at first, then steady, and Margaret wakes briefly to the sound of it against the window, an ordinary, almost comforting sound after 2 days of wind and silence at altitude, rain the way rain sounds at home, unhurried, patient, in no rush to stop. By the time the household properly wakes, it has settled into a soft grey morning, not the kind of weather that troubles anyone particularly, simply a day asking to be met a little more slowly than the ones before it, and Jean-Baptiste, consulted over breakfast, pronounces it entirely fine for travelling, a light rain in the foothills being, in his professional opinion, nothing at all compared to what the pass itself can produce on a bad week. They travel through the light rain for most of the morning, the family walking now rather than riding, since the last of the truly steep ground is behind them, and Jean-Baptiste has judged, correctly as it turns out, that the gentler slope ahead suits legs better than chairs. The rain does something pleasant to the chestnut woods they pass through, deepening the green of the leaves, releasing a smell from the wet earth that Margaret finds she likes rather more than she expected to, rich and mineral and faintly sweet, and Henry, delighted by the novelty of walking in weather nobody is scolding him for walking in, spends a happy quarter-hour stamping through every puddle the path presents him with, until his boots are thoroughly soaked and his mood thoroughly improved. Around midday they shelter for a spell under the wide eaves of a barn belonging to nobody Jean-Baptiste seems to know personally, but who nonetheless waves them in with the easy hospitality Margaret has come to associate with this whole stretch of country, and share a simple meal there, bread and hard cheese and the last of the grapes Pierre plucked yesterday, while the rain drums steadily on the roof above them, and a farmer's dog, uninvited but entirely welcome, settles itself against Henry's leg and stays there for the better part of an hour, to Henry's evident and vocal joy. It is here, sheltering out of the rain with little else to do but talk, that Margaret finally asks Jean-Baptiste, through Edmund, about his own life, a question she realizes with some embarrassment she has not thought to ask properly in 2 full days of relying on the man's judgment for her family's safety. He answers readily enough, unbothered by the question, a man of 42 years, as it turns out, born in a village not far from where their journey began, married with 3 children of his own, the eldest of whom, a boy of 15, has already started learning the route as Pierre is learning it now, walking alongside his father through the easier stretches, absorbing the particular knowledge of weather and snow and rock that cannot really be taught any other way except by years of simply being present on the mountain. He crosses this pass, he tells them, somewhere between 30 and 40 times each season, from late spring until the first heavy snows close the higher ground sometime in October, at which point he spends the winter months doing other work nearer his village, mending harness, cutting wood, the ordinary labour of a mountain winter. 30 to 40 crossings. Margaret does the arithmetic without quite meaning to, and finds the number almost impossible to hold in her mind properly, this single journey that has felt to her like one of the largest undertakings of her entire life, repeated by this one man, this same walk, these same chairs, these same careful judgments about weather and footing, dozens of times between April and October, every single year, for nearly 30 years now. She asks, a little hesitantly, whether he ever tires of it, whether the mountain ever simply becomes dull through sheer repetition, and Jean-Baptiste considers the question with real seriousness before answering, through Edmund, that the mountain is different every single time, the snow different, the light different, the travellers different, and that in any case a man does not tire of a thing that feeds his children. A plain answer that lands with more weight than Margaret quite expects it to, and that she finds herself turning over for the rest of the afternoon, long after the rain has finally eased and they have set out again toward the last stretch of the day's walk. By mid-afternoon they reach the point Jean-Baptiste has been steering them toward all day, a low stone building at the edge of a proper road, wide and level in a way that feels almost startling after 3 days of narrow mountain paths, where their carriage waits exactly as it was left, wheels and axles and body reassembled by hands Margaret never sees at work, but whose careful competence is obvious in the smooth, solid way the whole vehicle sits once she climbs back into it. There is something strange about settling back into the familiar shape of the carriage seat after 3 days of chairs and walking and mule tracks, a comfort that feels almost too easy now, cushioned and enclosed in a way that makes the mountain, only an hour behind them, already start to feel like something slightly unreal, a place they visited rather than a place they were. The trunks come back too, unloaded from the mules and restrapped to the carriage exactly where they belong, and Margaret watches for the small wool-wrapped bundle containing her mother's portrait with more anxiety than she quite wants to admit to, relief flooding through her properly, only once she has confirmed with her own hands that it has travelled the whole crossing safe and whole, still wrapped exactly as she packed it 4 days ago in a rented house beside a lake that already feels, strangely, like a very long time ago. Jean-Baptiste and Pierre and the chairmen, Mark among them, gather in the yard to see them off, and there is a round of handshakes and, from Henry, an enthusiastic and slightly overlong farewell to Pierre in particular, whom he has clearly decided is one of the finest people he has ever met in his 11 years of life. Edmund settles the final payment with Jean-Baptiste, a transaction conducted with the same unhurried, business-like ease that has characterized every part of this arrangement, and then, with a final round of nods and a few last words Margaret cannot follow, the guides turn back the way they came, back up toward the pass, back toward another family somewhere behind the Ashworths who will need exactly the same careful, practiced help getting across, and the carriage, at last, begins to roll forward on a proper road, toward Turin, toward Italy proper, toward the part of the tour that guidebooks and drawing-room conversations back in England actually tend to talk about. The road improves steadily as the afternoon wears on. the countryside settling into the kind of gentle, cultivated abundance Margaret associates with pictures of Italy rather than the wild grey heights of the last 3 days. Vineyards giving way in places to orchards, orchards to fields of something golden already half-harvested, farmhouses with red-tiled roofs scattered across a landscape that feels, after the mountain, almost domesticated by comparison, tamed in a way that Margaret finds herself, to her own mild surprise, missing the wildness of already. Charlotte, watching the changing countryside from the carriage window, asks her mother quietly whether she thinks the mountains looked the same 100 years ago, and Margaret, considering the question properly, admits she does not know, though she suspects the mountain itself has not changed much at all, only the people crossing it, generation after generation of travellers and traders and chairmen finding their own particular way over the same enduring rock, each of them certain, in their own moment, that their crossing is the one that matters most. Here is something Margaret could not have known, sitting in that carriage in the late summer of 1786, though I find it hard not to mention it to you now, since we have the strange privilege of looking backward at her whole world from somewhere she could never have imagined standing. Within 20 years of her crossing, engineers working under an entirely different political order would begin cutting a proper carriage road directly across these same mountains, wide and graded and solid enough that a coach could roll over the pass without ever needing to be taken apart, without ever needing the chairs, without ever needing John Baptiste and Pierre and Marc and the whole careful, practiced economy of guides and mule handlers that had made this particular crossing possible for centuries. It would be counted, when it was finished, as one of the great engineering achievements of its age, a road blasted and built through terrain that had previously demanded exactly what Margaret's family paid for: human labour, human judgment, human backs. I do not say this to diminish anything Margaret experienced, or anything Jean-Baptiste's family had built their working lives around for generations before her. I say it because there is something quietly moving, to me at least, in knowing that Margaret's crossing, uncomfortable and strange, and occasionally frightening as parts of it were, belonged to one of the very last generations who would ever have to make this particular journey in quite this particular way. Within a single lifetime, her own children's lifetime, the mountain would still be exactly as tall, exactly as cold, exactly as beautiful, but the specific human choreography of the crossing, the chairs and the disassembled carriage and the songs the chairmen sang to keep their pace, all of that would begin quietly fading into something people wrote about, rather than something people did. Margaret did not know this. Jean-Baptiste, most likely, had no idea either, going about his 30 or 40 crossings a season with no sense that he was living through the tail end of something, rather than the middle of it. That is often how these things go. Nobody standing inside a particular way of living tends to know it is a way of living that is nearly finished. The carriage rolls on through the golden late afternoon, and the family inside it, entirely unaware of any of this, simply watches the Italian countryside deepen in colour as the sun drops lower, Henry asleep now, with his head against his father's shoulder, worn out at last by 3 days of climbing and walking and mule chasing and beetle hunting. Charlotte still watching out the window with the same quiet, absorbed attention she gave to the scholar's Latin 2 nights ago, and Margaret, beside her, feeling something settle in her chest that she does not entirely have words for yet, something closer to gratitude than to any of the tour's usual vocabulary of wonder and admiration, gratitude simply for having been carried, safely, by strangers, across something so large and so old, and for having come out the other side of it not quite the same family that went in. Turin announces itself gradually, the way any real city does, farmhouses growing closer together, the road widening further, other carriages and carts appearing more frequently, until the traffic itself becomes a kind of evidence that a city is near, and then, finally, walls, gates, the particular ordered geometry of streets laid out with real intention, rather than simply worn into shape by centuries of footsteps, and Margaret, leaning to look out the window as they pass through the gate, feels the strange, familiar disorientation of arriving somewhere new after days of feeling like the journey itself had become the whole of her world. Their lodgings in Turin turn out to be a tall, handsome house on a quiet street not far from the city's main square, Arranged in advance through a letter of introduction Edmund carried the whole way from England, and the landlady who greets them, a formal, precise woman named Signora Bellini, manages a stiff but perfectly serviceable English that seems to relax slightly once she understands the family has just come over the pass rather than arriving by the easier southern roads most of her guests favour. There is real respect in the way she says it, over the pass, a small phrase that Margaret notices carries weight here in a way it never quite did back in England, where the crossing was mostly discussed as an inconvenience to be endured on the way to the paintings, rather than an accomplishment in its own right. The rooms themselves are elegant in a way that feels almost startling after 3 nights of mountain inns and hospice benches, high ceilings, proper carpets, a bed for Margaret and Edmund with linen so fine and so thoroughly aired that Margaret finds herself running her hand across it for a moment simply to feel the difference. There is a washstand with proper porcelain rather than the plain tin basins of the crossing, and a mirror considerably larger and considerably less cloudy than the one at the inn 2 nights ago, and Margaret catches her own reflection in it properly for the first time since Geneva, still faintly sunburnt across the nose, hair somewhat the worse for 3 days without proper attention, and finds that she does not mind the sight of herself half as much as she might have expected to. Supper that evening is a quieter affair than the crossing's shared tables, the family alone at a small table in a private dining room, Signora Bellini's cook producing a meal considerably more refined than beans and bread, though Henry, given the choice, admits with startling honesty that he rather preferred the beans, a confession that makes Edmund laugh properly for the first time in days. There is real wine again, and proper courses, and the particular formal comfort of a household run for exactly this purpose, receiving well-to-do English families and making them feel, for the duration of their stay, thoroughly attended to. And yet Margaret finds her mind wandering back, more than once during the meal, to the long table at that first inn, to the merchant and the young man walking alone, and the chairman explaining rotations to Charlotte, to a kind of company this elegant private dining room, for all its comforts, simply cannot offer. She does not say this aloud. She is not entirely sure Edmund would understand it, or perhaps he would understand it perfectly and simply not have words for it either, the particular way a shared fire and a shared pot of stew can create an intimacy that a private table, however finely laid, cannot quite replicate. After supper, once the children have finally been persuaded to bed, worn out properly now by the accumulated exhaustion of 3 mountain days catching up with them all at once, Margaret and Edmund step out briefly onto a small balcony that overlooks the quiet street below, the evening mild and soft in a way that feels almost unbelievable after the sharp mountain cold of only 2 nights ago. Somewhere in the city, faint and distant, a bell marks the hour, and beneath it, softer still, the ordinary murmur of a city settling toward its own night, voices and closing shutters and, once, laughter from somewhere down the street, quickly swallowed by distance. Margaret leans against the balcony rail and lets herself simply exist there for a few minutes, tired in the particular deep, satisfied way that comes only after real exertion properly rested from, and thinks, not for the first time since the crossing began, that she will likely never do anything quite like this again in her life, this specific combination of discomfort and wonder and strangers' kindness and her own children's faces lit with a kind of delight she does not often get to witness so purely. Edmund's hand finds hers on the rail, and neither of them says very much, and that, Margaret thinks, is exactly right, exactly enough, the whole enormous mountain behind them now folded quietly into something they will carry, rather than something they are still crossing. The house grows quiet slowly, the way houses do once a full day's exhaustion finally settles over everyone inside them, and by the time Margaret finally climbs into bed beside Edmund, the street below has gone almost entirely silent, just the occasional distant sound of a cart on cobblestones, somewhere several streets away, arriving and fading within the space of a few seconds. She lies for a while simply listening to the particular quality of this new silence, so different from the mountain silence, which had never really been silence at all but 100 small natural sounds layered together, wind and water and the shift of settling stone. This is a different kind of quiet, a city holding its breath for the night, walls thick enough to muffle whatever remains of the evening's activity, into something soft and far away. Candlelight moves faintly across the ceiling above her, the last candle in the room not yet extinguished, its small flame catching a slight draught from somewhere and throwing a thin shifting line of light and shadow across the plaster, a pattern that changes almost imperceptibly with each small movement of air, brightening, dimming, brightening again. Margaret watches it for a while without any particular thought attached to the watching, the way a person's eyes will sometimes simply follow a small moving thing purely because it is there, and the mind, worn out from a long day, has nothing more pressing to occupy it. Edmund's breathing beside her has already gone slow and even, the deep, unbothered sleep of a man whose body has spent 3 days doing something genuinely difficult and is now, finally, permitted to properly rest. She thinks about the texture of the day just past, the way a person sometimes does at the very edge of sleep, not in any ordered sequence but in loose drifting fragments, the smoothness of the linen beneath her hand, the particular soft resistance of the mattress compared to the harder, thinner bedding of the mountain inn, the sound Signora Bellini's shoes made on the tiled floor downstairs, brisk and precise, so different from the unhurried loose stride of the chairmen. Somewhere in the middle of comparing the texture of 2 entirely different beds, 3 nights apart, and a whole mountain range between them, Margaret Ashworth finally lets go of the day and sleeps. Morning in Turin arrives gently, filtered through proper curtains rather than the thin mountain light of the last 3 days, and the household wakes at its own unhurried pace rather than to the urgency of a journey still ahead of it. There is a lightness to the morning that Margaret notices immediately, a kind of collective, unspoken relief among all 4 of them. The crossing behind them now, successfully, safely, with nothing worse to show for it than sunburnt noses and Henry's boots still faintly damp from yesterday's puddles. Breakfast is taken slowly, bread and fruit and a dark, strong coffee that Edmund pronounces excellent and Margaret finds rather too bitter for her taste, softened somewhat with a generous addition of milk that earns her a small, fond, slightly teasing look from her husband. Edmund spends part of the morning finishing his letter to his brother, adding, Margaret notices when she glances over his shoulder, rather more detail about the crossing than she expected him to include, the chairs, the hospice, even a brief careful mention of the stars, though nothing, she is relieved to see, about her own quiet tears in the cold outside the hospice door 2 nights ago, a detail she had not mentioned to him directly but suspects, from the particular gentleness with which he has been treating her since, that he noticed anyway and has simply chosen, with real tact, not to say so. Charlotte, meanwhile, has commandeered a small writing desk of her own in the corner of the sitting room and is composing, with evident seriousness, her own letter, not to any relative back home, but, Margaret discovers only later, to the scholar from the hospice, a careful, formal note thanking him for his answer to a question and asking, with the particular boldness of a 15-year-old who has not yet learnt to be embarrassed by her own curiosity, whether he might recommend any books on the subject that a young Englishwoman could reasonably obtain. Margaret does not interfere, she simply watches her daughter's careful, concentrated handwriting fill the page, and feels, once again, that particular ache of pride that has been visiting her at odd moments ever since that first evening at the mountain inn. I want to take you back to the mountain itself for a while, if you do not mind, away from the Ashworths and Signora Bellini's tidy sitting room, because there is more to say about that pass than one family's 3-day crossing could ever properly hold. The Alps that Margaret walked and rode across had been forming, in the patient, unhurried way mountains form, for tens of millions of years before any traveller crossed them at all, layers of ancient seabed pushed slowly upward as one great section of the earth's crust pressed against another, folding and buckling over spans of time so vast that the whole of human history, every crossing anyone has ever made, amounts to something less than the very last blink of that process. The rock beneath the chairman's feet, the same pale grey stone Henry pressed his palm against near the summit, had in some places begun its existence at the bottom of an ocean that no longer exists anywhere on earth. The snow that never fully melts at the higher elevations, the patches Henry touched with such delight, exists there because of a simple, steady arithmetic between altitude and temperature, each 1,000 feet of elevation gained costing several degrees of warmth, until at a certain height, even in the fullest heat of an August afternoon, the air itself is simply too cold to let the previous winter's snow finish disappearing before the next winter's snow arrives to replace it. Higher still, in places the Ashworth's route did not reach, that accumulated snow compresses over centuries into something else entirely, ice-thick and old enough to move, however slowly, under its own weight, carving the valleys and sharpening the ridgelines that gave the whole range its dramatic, jagged character, a process working on a timescale so patient that a single human lifetime, even a long one, barely registers against it at all. Weather up there follows its own logic too, one that guides like Jean-Baptiste learned not from any book but from decades of simply being present in all its moods, a logic Margaret's guidebook could only gesture at in the vaguest terms. Storms that gather almost invisibly on the far side of a ridge and arrive with startling speed. Temperature differences between a sunlit slope and a shadowed one that can feel, at the same hour of the same day, like two entirely different seasons. Snow that falls even in high summer at the very highest elevations, though rarely enough to trouble a late August crossing like this one. A guide's whole professional worth in a landscape like this comes down largely to a kind of accumulated, embodied pattern recognition, a sense for which particular cloud, which particular shift in the wind, means simply changeable weather, and which means genuine caution, knowledge that cannot be written down in any guidebook because it depends entirely on having watched this specific stretch of mountain behave this specific way, over and over, across enough seasons to trust the pattern. Travellers had been finding their way across passes like this one for a very long time before Margaret's crossing, long enough that by the 1780s, entire small economies, entire family trades had grown up around the simple practical fact of the mountain standing where it stood. Some of the routes across the Alps had carried travellers since well before recorded history reliably tells us who they were or why they crossed, and by the time of the Roman world, certain passes were formal enough to carry proper roads, milestones, way stations, a level of engineered infrastructure that would not really be matched again in these particular mountains until the road-building projects of Margaret's grandchildren's generation. In between those two eras, for well over 1,000 years, crossings depended largely on exactly the kind of arrangement the Ashworths relied upon. Local knowledge, local labour, guides and chairmen and innkeepers whose skill filled the gap that no formal road existed yet to fill. Picture for a moment what this same crossing looked like in the depths of winter, though Margaret's own journey happened safely in the mild tail end of summer and never had to reckon with it directly. By late October most years, the higher passes closed themselves to ordinary travel, the hospice becoming less a stopping point for tourists and rather more a genuine sanctuary for the small, hardy population of local people whose lives simply continued through the cold months regardless. Herders bringing animals down to lower pastures, villagers moving between settlements for reasons that could not wait for spring, occasional couriers still carrying urgent letters across even the worst of the weather, bundled heavily, moving with a caution entirely unlike the courier's dead run Margaret's family witnessed on their own gentler crossing. The monks kept their fire built high all winter, every winter, precisely because they understood, in a way no summer traveller quite needed to, how much a single warm room could matter to a person who had spent the day fighting their way through snow up to their knees. There is something almost comforting in picturing it, oddly, that steady fire burning through months of deep cold, tended faithfully whether or not anyone happened to need it on a given night. A small, patient act of readiness performed year after year by men whose names, like the chairmen's, mostly went unrecorded. A traveller arriving half-frozen in January would find the same unhurried welcome Margaret found in August, the same plain soup, the same low fire, the mountain's harshest season, met not with fear, but with generations of practiced preparation, wood-cut and stacked through the milder months, precisely for nights exactly like that one. By spring, when the last heavy snow finally began to soften and the passes reopened properly to travellers like the Ashworths, the whole working economy of the crossing would stir back to life almost at once, guides checking the state of paths that had been buried and reshaped by an entire winter's weather, chairmen repairing poles that had sat unused since October, innkeepers restocking cellars in anticipation of the season's first travellers, Jean-Baptiste's own season, he had mentioned to them sheltering from the rain in that barn, ran from late spring until the first real snows of autumn, a working rhythm shaped entirely by the mountain's own moods rather than by any calendar a person in a city might keep, and Margaret's own crossing, coming as it did in the last days of August, had landed near the comfortable middle of that rhythm, neither the anxious uncertainty of an early spring crossing, nor the hurried caution of one made too close to the season's end. I think about that rhythm sometimes, the way an entire community's working year could be shaped so completely by something as impersonal as snowfall, and I find something quietly admirable in it, not a life of hardship exactly, though it surely held real hardship within it, but a life lived in close, attentive relationship with a specific piece of the natural world, a relationship most of us, in our own lives, rarely get to practice with anything at all. Back in Turin, the days that follow settle into their own gentle rhythm, quite different from the sharp, forward momentum of the crossing itself. The family spends 2 further days in the city before continuing on toward Milan and eventually further south, and those 2 days pass in the unhurried manner of a household finally allowed to rest properly after real exertion. Edmund calls on the banker whose letter of credit he has been carrying since Geneva, a brief, formal business visit that leaves him in a notably good humour for the rest of the afternoon, the kind of relief that comes from confirming, in person, that a plan made weeks in advance has actually held together the way it was supposed to. Margaret, for her part, spends a good portion of the first full day simply walking the streets near their lodgings with Charlotte, no particular destination in mind, stopping wherever something catches either of their attention, a church whose front Charlotte insists on sketching badly in a small notebook she has been keeping since Lyon, a shop selling gloves in a leather so soft Margaret allows herself the small indulgence of a new pair, a fountain in a quiet square where they simply sit for a while and watch the ordinary business of a city continuing around them, servants filling jugs, children chasing something Margaret never quite identifies, an old man feeding pigeons with the patient, repetitive devotion of someone for whom this has clearly become the central occupation of his day. Henry, meanwhile, has attached himself to a groom at the stables where their carriage horses are being rested and reshod, and spends a genuinely alarming amount of both days there, to Margaret's mild despair and Edmund's quiet amusement, returning each evening smelling faintly of horse and full of new vocabulary in Italian that nobody in the family can quite verify the accuracy of, though he deploys it with such total confidence that Signora Bellini's cook, overhearing him at supper on the second evening, laughs so hard she has to sit down, which Henry takes, entirely correctly, as a great personal triumph. It is on the second evening, their last in Turin before continuing the tour proper, that Charlotte finally receives a reply, remarkably quick given the timing, from the scholar at the hospice, who it turns out was himself travelling onward to Turin, and simply handed his answer to a fellow lodger bound the same direction rather than trusting it to the ordinary post. The letter is longer than Margaret expected, several pages, careful and generous, listing books and, more surprisingly, naming 2 women he happens to know of, one in Bologna and one somewhat further afield, who have managed, through considerable determination, to pursue exactly the kind of study Charlotte had asked about. Margaret watches her daughter read it twice through at the supper table, entirely oblivious to the food cooling in front of her, and thinks, not for the first time this week, that whatever else this particular grand tour accomplishes, whatever paintings get seen, and whatever ruins get properly admired in the weeks ahead, this letter and the mountain crossing that led to it may end up mattering rather more to her daughter's future than anything on the official itinerary Edmund so carefully planned back in Derbyshire 14 months ago. They leave Turin on a bright, cool morning, the carriage loaded once more, Signora Bellini seeing them off from her doorstep with a formality that has, over 3 days, warmed into something almost fond, and the road south unspools before them wide and level and entirely unremarkable in the best possible way. No chairs required, no mules, no careful negotiation of narrow paths above long drops, simply a carriage moving at a steady, comfortable pace through a countryside that grows more purely, recognisably Italian with every passing mile, cypress trees standing dark and slender along field boundaries, farmhouses the colour of old cream, a sky that seems, even in early September, to hold a different quality of light than anything Margaret remembers from home. Henry sleeps for most of the first hour, worn out from an early start and a farewell to the stable groom that involved. Margaret gathers rather more emotion on Henry's part than the brief acquaintance strictly warranted. Charlotte reads, or pretends to, the scholar's letter tucked carefully inside the cover of her book, consulted every so often when she thinks nobody is watching. Edmund reviews his notes on Milan, the next proper stop on their itinerary, already turning his attention forward the way he tends to, a planner by nature, already half living in the next city before they have properly left this one behind. Margaret alone, for a while, simply looks backward, out the rear window of the carriage, watching the foothills recede and, behind them, faint now with distance and haze, the pale grey suggestion of the higher peaks they crossed only days ago, already looking, from this distance, like something almost unreal, a painted backdrop rather than a place she actually walked and was carried across and cried quietly outside of under an impossible density of stars. She wonders, watching them fade, whether Jean-Baptiste is somewhere on that mountain right now, another chair on his shoulder, another family's trunk on his mule, another crossing already well underway, entirely unconcerned with whether the Ashworths have moved on, because of course he would be, because that mountain and that work do not pause simply because one particular family has finished with them. That thought, oddly, does not sadden her. If anything, it comforts her, this sense that the whole intricate, patient machinery of the crossing continues on regardless, waiting for whoever needs it next, spring after spring, family after family, long after the Ashworths themselves have returned to Derbyshire and settled back into the ordinary, unmountainous rhythm of English country life. Some things, she thinks, are not diminished by being repeated. Some things are made more remarkable by it, a whole world of skill and patience and quiet welcome, offered fresh to every traveller who needs it, whether that traveller is a wealthy family with 4 chairs and a train of mules, or a young man with nothing but a bundle over one shoulder and boots that have walked further than most people's entire lives. The higher peaks slip finally out of sight behind a fold of nearer hills, and Margaret turns back to face forward, toward Milan, toward whatever the rest of this long tour still holds, and finds she is smiling, faintly, at nothing in particular, simply at the accumulated weight of the last 4 days, settling somewhere comfortable inside her, a story she will tell, imperfectly, smoothed and simplified, the way all good travel stories eventually get smoothed, for the rest of her life. Let me take you back up there one more time, if you are still with me, back to the mountain itself, now that Margaret and her family are safely rolling toward Milan and no longer need our attention. There is something I find myself wanting to sit inside a little longer, the particular texture of a place like that, pass at the hour when travellers like the Ashworths have already gone to sleep in their comfortable churrin beds, and the mountain, left mostly to itself, settles into whatever it is a mountain does when nobody is watching it. Picture the hospice at that hour, the long room where the family shared soup with scholars and a solitary walker, empty now of that particular crowd, though never truly empty for long on this route, always someone arriving, always someone needing the fire. One of the monks moves through the room in the deep quiet before midnight, checking the banked coals, adding a little more wood, not because the room needs it tonight particularly, but because tomorrow it will. And readiness, up here, is simply a habit practiced so long it has stopped feeling like a choice at all. Outside, the same impossible density of stars Margaret stood beneath 2 nights ago continues its slow wheel overhead, entirely indifferent to whether anyone is standing in the cold to appreciate it, the way stars generally are. Somewhere lower down the mountain, in the village Jean-Baptiste calls home, his own household has long since gone quiet for the night, his wife asleep, his younger children asleep, his eldest boy perhaps lying awake a little longer than the rest, the way boys of 15 sometimes do, thinking about the crossing he made today with his father, another family carried, another set of trunks delivered safely, the particular satisfaction of a body genuinely tired from real work rather than restless with unspent energy. Jean-Baptiste himself sleeps the deep, dreamless sleep of a man who has walked this same demanding ground several dozen times already this season and will walk it several dozen times more before the snows close it for the winter. a rhythm so thoroughly worn into his body by now that his muscles, Margaret would be surprised to learn, barely register the exertion as exertion anymore, simply as the ordinary shape of a working day. The mules, stabled somewhere nearby, stand mostly still through the night the way mules do, occasionally shifting weight from one leg to another, occasionally huffing softly at nothing in particular, patient animals whose whole understanding of the world consists largely of load and path and rest, load and path and rest, a cycle repeated so many thousands of times across a working life that it has become, in its own way, a kind of contentment, or at least the closest thing a mule's mind has room for. The small bell that marked their position on the trail hangs quiet now on a peg near the stable door, waiting for morning, waiting for the next family, whoever they turn out to be, whatever language they arrive speaking, whatever reasons brought them this far from home to trust their whole safety to strangers on a mountain. And above all of it, unmoved by any of these small human and animal rhythms playing out in villages and hospices along its length, the mountain itself simply continues being what it has been for longer than any measure of human time can comfortably hold, rock laid down at the bottom of an ocean that vanished millions of years before the first person ever needed to cross from one side of these peaks to the other, folded and lifted by forces too vast and too slow for any single lifetime to properly witness, patient in a way that makes even Jean-Baptiste's 30 years of crossings look, from the mountain's own perspective, like something that happened this morning. Consider for a moment the whole turning year that Pass moves through, season after season, family after family, in a rhythm that would have been entirely familiar to Jean-Baptiste and utterly invisible to most of the travellers who only ever experienced one single crossing of it in their lives. Spring arrives up there reluctantly, weeks behind the valleys below, snow lingering in the shadowed folds long after the lower slopes have gone properly green, and the first crossings of the season carry their own particular caution, guides testing ground that has not been properly walked since the previous autumn, watching for softened snowbanks, listening for the particular sound that tells an experienced ear a slope is not quite ready to be trusted yet. By early summer, the route settles into something closer to routine, the pattern the Ashworths themselves experienced: steady traffic, familiar footing, a working rhythm that Jean-Baptiste and men like him could probably manage with their eyes closed by August, though of course they never quite do, attention being the one thing this work never entirely permits a person to set down. High summer brings the heaviest traffic of the year, English families finishing the northern leg of their tours before autumn, merchants moving goods before the passes narrow their reliable window, and the whole small economy of the crossing runs at its fullest capacity, every chair in use, every mule booked days in advance, every bed at every inn along the route claimed most nights of the week. Autumn changes the mountain's character again, the light growing lower and more golden, the same transformation Margaret watched happen in miniature across her own 3 days on the crossing, and the traffic thins as the season advances, the last confident travellers making their crossings before the weather turns properly uncertain, guides watching the sky with a bit more care each week, judging how many more comfortable crossings the season has left in it before the first serious snow arrives and closes the higher ground for another half a year. And then winter, the quiet months, the ones we sat inside together a little while ago, the hospice fire burning steady through the cold, the mountain mostly left to itself, and to the small hardy population who never really leave it at all, until spring comes reluctantly around again, and the whole cycle begins once more, the way it has begun and ended, for longer than any single family's memory could ever properly hold. Other travellers would follow the Ashworths across that same pass in the weeks after their own crossing, though none of them, of course, would ever know it, each family experiencing their own 3 or 4 days, as though the mountain existed freshly, just for them. A young couple, perhaps, newly married, making a shorter version of the tour before returning home to start a family of their own, delighted and slightly overwhelmed by the whole strange choreography of chairs and mules in exactly the way Margaret had been, a diplomat's household, moving with rather more baggage and rather more formality, treating the crossing as simply one more logistical challenge among the many that came with a life spent constantly relocating between postings, a pair of young artists, sketchbooks in hand, stopping far more often than any guide would prefer to capture some particular fold of rock or quality of light, testing Jean-Baptiste's patience perhaps, though not his professionalism, which would carry them safely across regardless of how many times they insisted on stopping to draw. Each of these crossings, imagined or real, would have felt to the people living through it like the whole of the experience, complete in itself, remarkable, personal, and each of them would have depended, exactly as Margaret's did, on the same patient, largely unrecorded skill of guides and chairmen and innkeepers and monks, the same mules carrying the same kind of trunks, the same fire kept burning at the hospice through whatever weather the mountain happened to produce that particular week. It is a strange, quiet comfort, I think, imagining all of those overlapping, mostly forgotten journeys, layered one on top of another across decade after decade of the same enduring stretch of rock. There is a particular pleasure, I think, in dwelling on the practical details of a journey like this one, the sort of thing that never quite makes it into a family's polished letters home, but that shaped every single hour of the actual experience. Consider what a family like the Ashworths would have packed specifically for the crossing itself, separate from the trunks bound for Italy proper, a smaller bag kept close at hand containing warmer clothing than the season down in the valleys required, since the temperature at the higher elevations could drop sharply enough, even in late August, to demand a proper wool cloak rather than the lighter garments suited to a Geneva evening. Margaret would have packed gloves, sturdy ones, not the delicate kind meant for a dinner party, and a bonnet with a brim substantial enough to shield her sunburnt face from a sun that, at altitude, bites rather harder than it does at sea level, a lesson her own reddened nose taught her rather more effectively than any guidebook warning could have. The sedan chairs themselves deserve a closer look too, since Margaret spent so many hours of her crossing settled into one. Built typically from a light but sturdy wood, ash or cyniot depending on what grew locally and what the chairmen's fathers had taught them to trust, the seat itself padded modestly with cloth or leather, enough to soften a full day's jostling without adding unnecessary weight for the men carrying it. The two long poles that ran the length of the chair were shaped and smoothed by years of use, worn to a particular polish at the exact points where a chairman's shoulder habitually rested, a kind of accidental customization that happened not through any deliberate craftsmanship, but simply through repetition, the same shoulder finding the same spot on the same pole, crossing after crossing, until the wood itself had quietly adapted to the man carrying it. A chairman's technique, too, held more craft than a passing observer like Margaret would likely have noticed on her first hour in the chair. A team of 4 did not simply lift and walk. They developed, across a season of working together, a shared rhythm specific to their particular group, a cadence of steps that let the chair's motion stay smooth rather than jolting. Weight shifted subtly forward on an ascent and back on a descent, the 2 men at the front and the 2 at the rear adjusting their pace by fractions of a second to keep the whole apparatus level, even as the ground beneath their own feet pitched and buckled unpredictably. It was, in its own unglamorous way, a genuine athletic skill, refined over years, invisible to most of the people who benefited from it, precisely because it was performed so well. Food along the route followed its own practical logic too, shaped entirely by what could reasonably be carried, what could be reliably stocked at the scattered inns and hospices, and what would actually sustain a body doing hard physical work at altitude. Bread featured at nearly every meal, dense and long-keeping, along with hard cheeses that travelled well without spoiling, dried meats when available, and, at the hospice particularly, the kind of simple warming soup that could be kept going in a large pot for days at a time, added to and replenished as ingredients allowed, feeding whoever happened to arrive that particular evening regardless of how many mouths it turned out to be. Wine, weak and watered for the children, stronger for the adults, appeared at nearly every table, less an indulgence than simply the safest, most reliable drink available in a region where the purity of plain water could not always be trusted. The mules themselves are worth lingering on a little, since an entire family's safety across the pass rested, quite literally, on the sure-footedness of these unglamorous, endlessly patient animals, bred and raised specifically for mountain work, sturdier through the chest and shorter in the leg than the horses Margaret was accustomed to at home, mules possessed a particular quality of caution on uncertain ground that made them, despite their reputation back in England as stubborn or difficult, genuinely better suited to this work than any horse could have been. A horse, faced with a narrow path and a long drop, might panic. A mule, more often than not, simply stopped, assessed, and either proceeded with careful deliberation or refused outright, a refusal that experienced handlers like Jean-Baptiste had learned, over years, to trust rather than fight, since a mule's hesitation on a mountain path was frequently a better judge of the ground's safety than any human eye. Each animal on a crossing like the Ashworths would have been known individually to its handler, not simply as interchangeable livestock, but as a creature with its own temperament, its own particular quirks, the way Pierre knew which mule tolerated Henry's enthusiastic petting, and which preferred to be left entirely alone. Loads were distributed according to each animal's proven strength and steadiness, the more valuable or fragile items, a family's better clothing, important papers, entrusted to the calmest and most reliable mule in the string, while sturdier, less breakable cargo went to animals still building trust with their handlers. This was not sentiment, it was simply good practice, refined across generations of men who depended on these animals for their entire livelihood and had learnt, through hard experience, that treating a mule as a partner in the work rather than a mere tool produced far more reliable results across a long season of crossings. Pierre, at 16, was still deep in the middle of his own long apprenticeship in all of this, learning not from any formal instruction but simply by being present, by watching Jean-Baptiste's judgments and slowly absorbing the reasoning behind them, by handling the animals daily until his own hands developed the same instinctive sense for a mule's mood that his elders already possessed. In another few years, guides who knew both men agreed, Pierre would likely be leading his own crossings, training some younger boy in turn, the whole chain of knowledge passing quietly from one generation to the next, the way it always had, never written down in any single place, existing instead entirely in the accumulated, practiced memory of men who had simply spent enough seasons on that particular mountain to know it the way Margaret knew the layout of her own house in Derbyshire. I find something genuinely moving in that image, a whole body of essential, life-preserving knowledge held together not by books or schools, but by nothing more than one generation patiently showing the next, season after season, until the mountain itself became, in a sense, a kind of inherited language, spoken fluently by men whose formal education by the standards of Edmund's own upbringing would have been considered minimal at best. Knowledge, this crossing makes plain if a person sits with it long enough, comes in more forms than the kind Edmund kept in his careful ledgers and his letters of credit. Let us return, too, to the question of why a family like the Ashworths undertook this whole extraordinary, expensive, occasionally uncomfortable journey in the first place. A question Margaret herself turned over more than once across those 14 months, though rarely all at once, more often in fragments, prompted by some particular moment or conversation along the way. Part of it, plainly, was simple fashion, the grand tour having become, by the 1780s, something close to an expected finishing stage for a young gentleman of Henry's eventual station, a chance to see, first-hand, the classical world that so much of his English education had already trained him to revere second-hand, through translated texts and engraved illustrations that could only ever gesture at the real thing. But there was more to it than fashion alone, at least for a family like this one. Edmund had spoken to Margaret back in Derbyshire before they ever left, about wanting his children, Charlotte as much as Henry, to see with their own eyes that England, for all its comforts and all its confidence, was not the whole of the world, that other countries had built their own remarkable things, developed their own customs, produced their own scholars and painters and, as it turned out, their own chairmen and mule handlers whose particular expertise England's gentler landscape had simply never required. It was in its own quiet way an argument against a certain kind of complacency, though Edmund would probably never have phrased it in quite those terms himself. Margaret's own reasons, she came to realize somewhere around the middle of the tour, were rather less lofty and rather more personal. She had married at 19, had Charlotte at 20, had spent the following 15 years largely within a fairly narrow radius of Derbyshire, competent and content in that life, but rarely, if she was honest with herself, genuinely tested by it. The tour, whatever else it accomplished for her children's education, had become, unexpectedly, a kind of test for her as well, a chance to discover what she was actually capable of when the comfortable structures of home were stripped away, when she had to trust strangers, adapt to unfamiliar food and unfamiliar beds, and, on this particular stretch of the journey, quite literally hand her own physical safety over to 4 men she had known for less than a day. She had not expected to find, at 34, that she still had capacities for wonder and endurance she had simply never had occasion to test before. The mountain, more than any cathedral or gallery on the entire itinerary, had given her that. Charlotte's reasons, though nobody had asked her to articulate them, and she likely could not have done so fully herself at 15, seemed to Margaret, watching her daughter across these last several days, to be quietly forming themselves in real time. The letter to the scholar, the fierce attention she paid to every new piece of information the journey offered her, evidence of a mind reaching for something larger than the narrow set of expectations a young Englishwoman of her class was typically permitted to reach for. Whether that reaching would amount to anything, whether the world Charlotte was growing into would actually make room for whatever she turned out to want, Margaret could not say. But she found herself hoping, watching her daughter's careful handwriting fill page after page of correspondence with a scholar twice her age, that it would. The road to Milan takes the better part of 2 full days, unremarkable by comparison with everything that came before it, and Margaret finds herself, more than once along that stretch, almost missing the demanding attention the mountain required, the way a person sometimes misses the particular focus a hard task demands, even after the relief of finishing it. Ordinary road travel, however comfortable, asks rather less of a person than 4 men lifting you above a valley on their own shoulders, and there is a strange flatness to the return of comfort that Margaret had not anticipated, a kind of anticlimax she does not mention to Edmund, suspecting he would not entirely understand it, or perhaps suspecting he would understand it exactly as well as she does, and simply not have the words for it either. Milan itself arrives the way cities do, gradually and then suddenly, and the family settles into the next stage of their tour with the same competent, well-practiced rhythm they have developed across 14 months of exactly this kind of arrival, lodgings secured in advance, letters of introduction presented, a cathedral to be properly admired, paintings to be sought out and discussed at length over supper. Henry finds a new fascination almost immediately, this time in the enormous half-finished cathedral itself, climbing as many of its accessible stairs as the family's guide will permit, and returning breathless and thoroughly pleased with himself. Charlotte writes, within her first evening in the city, a second letter to the scholar, this one considerably longer than the first, and Margaret, catching sight of a few lines over her daughter's shoulder, notices with quiet amusement that Charlotte has begun, without any prompting from anyone, to develop something that looks remarkably like her own independent opinions about the paintings they have seen, opinions that occasionally, respectfully, disagree with her father's. Edmund, for his part, spends a good portion of their first Milan evening writing yet another letter home, and Margaret, glancing over as she settles into a chair nearby with her own needlework, catches him rereading a passage about the crossing with an expression she cannot quite name, somewhere between pride and something softer, something almost wistful, as though even in the writing of it, only days removed from the actual experience, some part of him already understands that this particular stretch of the tour, however uncomfortable parts of it were, will end up mattering to him more than almost anything else 14 months of touring produced. She does not ask him about it directly. Some conversations she has learnt across 15 years of marriage are better left to arrive in their own time, if they arrive at all, and in any case she suspects she already knows roughly what he would say, some version of the same thing she has been turning over in her own mind since that first night at the Mountain Inn. That comfort, real comfort, the kind Signora Bellini's fine linen and Milan's grand cathedral and every other elegant stop on this tour has offered them in such generous supply, is not in the end quite the same thing as being alive to a place, fully, entirely, the way she was alive to that mountain, cold and carried and astonished, for 3 unforgettable days at the very end of August. Let us slow down now, all the way down, and simply sit for a while inside the feeling of that crossing, rather than following the family any further along their itinerary, because the rest of the Ashworth's tour, Rome and Naples and all the famous sights still ahead of them, belongs to a different kind of story than the one we have been telling tonight. What I want to leave you with instead is the mountain itself, held gently, the way you might hold a stone you picked up on a walk and slipped into your pocket without any particular plan for it, just because it felt good in your hand. Picture the chair again, if you will, that specific rhythm of being lifted and carried, 4 men breathing in that shared, practiced cadence, the poles creaking faintly with each shift of weight, the ground moving steadily beneath you though your own legs are doing none of the work. There is something in that motion, that surrendered, trusting motion, that the body remembers even after the mind has moved on to other things, a kind of rocking not unlike the one that used to put you to sleep as a child, if you were lucky enough to have someone who carried you that way once, arms or shoulders bearing your whole weight while your own muscles finally, fully let go. There is the fire at the hospice too, built high against a cold that does not care who you are or what you can afford, burning steady through a long night for whoever happens to arrive needing it, a merchant or a scholar or a solitary walker with nothing but a bundle over one shoulder, all of them equally welcome, equally warmed. There is something in that fire worth carrying with you towards sleep tonight, this idea that shelter, real shelter, does not ask very much of the people who need it, only that they arrive, cold and tired, and be willing to sit close enough to feel the warmth. Now the stars above the hospice, that impossible density of them, thin cold air doing something to the light that made the whole sky feel closer than any sky Margaret had known before, close enough almost to touch, close enough to cry quietly beneath without anyone needing to see or understand why. Some nights simply ask something of us that we did not know we were carrying until the crying starts, and there is no shame in that, none at all, only the quiet relief of a weight finally being allowed to set itself down, the way Margaret's did, briefly, alone in the cold, before she wiped her face and went back inside to the warmth of her sleeping family. Picture the small bell on the lead mule, its clear, irregular sound marking a safe position on a blind curve, a small warning offered freely to whoever else might be coming the other way, traveller and trader and courier alike, all of them sharing the same narrow strip of ground, all of them, in their own way, looking out for each other simply because the mountain demanded it of them, indifferent as it was to any of their individual purposes. And picture, last of all, the sound of chairmen singing, low and unhurried, not performing for anyone, simply filling a long task with a rhythm that made the carrying easier, the walking easier, the whole enormous undertaking of getting an ordinary family safely across an extraordinary piece of the earth, just a little more bearable, a little more human for everyone involved. There is a particular kind of gratitude that travel like this can teach a person if they let it, and I think Margaret learnt some version of it on that mountain, even if she never quite found the precise words for it in any of the letters she eventually wrote home. It is not the gratitude of having seen something remarkable, though she plainly saw that. It is closer to the gratitude of having been, briefly, entirely dependent on the skill and goodwill of people she would never see again after those 3 days, people whose names she barely had time to properly learn, and having found that dependence met, again and again, with nothing but steady, unhurried competence and quiet kindness. Jean-Baptiste did not need to sing while he walked. The innkeeper did not need to serve the lone walker the same portion as the merchant. The monks did not need to keep that fire burning quite so high for travellers who might never pass this way again, and yet they did, all of them, because that was simply the shape their working lives had taken, generosity worn smooth into habit across generations, the way water wears a channel into stone, not through any single dramatic event, but through the same small motion, repeated more times than anyone could ever properly count. I think about how many crossings like this one must have happened across the centuries before anyone thought to write any of them down, ordinary families and merchants and pilgrims and soldiers, each one certain, in their own moment, that their particular journey mattered enormously, each one entirely unaware of the thousands of other crossings happening in exactly the same way, on exactly the same ground, in the centuries before and the centuries after their own. There is something almost dizzying in trying to hold all of that at once, and something quietly comforting in it too, this sense that a single evening's discomfort, a single night's fear, a single moment of tears in the cold outside a hospice door belongs to a far larger, far older pattern of human beings simply finding ways to help each other across difficult ground, over and over, long before any of them had the vocabulary of history to describe what they were part of. Decades after Margaret's own crossing, the engineered road we spoke of earlier would finally cut its way through, wide enough for a proper coach, graded gently enough that the whole elaborate choreography of chairs and disassembled carriages would gradually become unnecessary, remembered mostly in old letters and older family stories told at dinner tables by grandchildren who had never themselves needed to be carried across anything. Even later still, well over a century after that, the passes would carry railways, then motorways, engineering marvels of their own era that would make the whole 3-day undertaking Margaret's family completed feel, to a modern traveller, almost unimaginably slow, almost unimaginably strange, a full day's careful, human-powered labour accomplishing what a car or a train now manages in a couple of unremarkable hours. And yet the mountain itself, through all of that, through every generation of changing technology and changing travellers, has remained essentially unmoved, the same patient rock, the same thin cold air at altitude, the same impossible density of stars on a clear night far from any city's light. What changed across all those centuries was never really the mountain. It was only ever the manner in which people found their way across it. And I find something here that stays with me, this idea that the true, unchanging centre of the story was never Margaret's chair or Jean-Baptiste's mules or even the eventual engineered roads that would replace them, but simply the mountain itself, indifferent, enormous, patient, waiting, the same as it always had been, for whoever needed to cross it next. Margaret Ashworth lived, as it happens, to a reasonably old age, well into her 70s, long enough to see Henry grow into a rather serious, well-liked country gentleman not so different from his father, and long enough to see Charlotte, against a fair amount of quiet family resistance that Margaret herself worked steadily to dissolve over the years, pursue a correspondence with scholars across half of Europe that eventually produced, though never under her own name, several contributions to a body of natural history writing that a handful of careful researchers would recognise, generations later, as genuinely valuable. Margaret kept, for the rest of her life, a small wooden mule no larger than a thumb, worn smooth from handling, tucked into a drawer in her writing desk alongside letters and pressed flowers and the ordinary accumulated debris of a long, full life, and family stories suggest she would take it out occasionally, in her later years, and simply hold it for a while, turning it over in her fingers without any particular explanation offered to whichever grandchild happened to be watching. She spoke of the crossing, in her old age, more often than any other single stretch of that 14-month tour, more than the ruins of Rome, more than any painting or cathedral or famous view the itinerary had so carefully arranged for her. She spoke of the singing, mostly, and the stars, and, once late in her life, to a granddaughter who happened to catch her in an unusually candid mood by the fire, she mentioned, briefly, quietly, that she had cried outside a mountain hospice once, alone, in the cold, for reasons she still could not entirely explain even 50 years later, only that something in her had needed, that particular night, simply to be let go of, and that the mountain, somehow, without asking anything of her in return, had let it happen. I think about that granddaughter sometimes, hearing that story second-hand, decades removed from the actual night it describes, and I think about you, now, hearing it second-hand again, decades further removed still, and I find it quietly remarkable that a single private moment of grief and release, experienced by one woman on one mountainside on one particular night in 1786, could travel this far, through this many retellings, and still arrive with enough weight to be worth telling. That is perhaps what all of history actually is, when you get right down to it, not the treaties and the famous battles and the grand engineering projects, though those matter too, but this, the small, ordinary, deeply felt moments that somehow manage to survive the centuries, passed carefully from one generation to the next, until eventually, entirely by accident, they land here, tonight, with you. Maybe you are the kind of person who has cried somewhere unexpected once yourself, somewhere beautiful, somewhere that had no obvious reason to unlock whatever it unlocked in you. Maybe you have been carried, literally or otherwise, by people you barely knew, and found, to your own surprise, that the trust required by that surrender turned out to be easier to give than you expected. Maybe you have simply stood beneath a genuinely dark sky once, far from any city, and felt the particular vertigo of realizing how small your own concerns actually are against something that old, that patient, that entirely unbothered by the specific shape of your one small life. If any of that is true, even a little, then you have more in common with Margaret Ashworth than 3 centuries of distance would ever suggest, and there is something worth resting in, tonight, in that thought, this quiet, continuous thread connecting a woman crossing the Alps in 1786 to you, wherever you are, whatever brought you here tonight, settled now under your own blanket, in your own version of the dark. Edmund lived a shorter life than his wife, as it turned out, passing rather suddenly in his early 60s from a chest complaint that the physicians of the time had few real answers for, and Margaret, in the years of widowhood that followed, found herself returning, in her own private thoughts, to that mountain crossing more often than to any of the years of comfortable, settled marriage that came after it, not because those later years lacked their own happiness, they did not, but because something about those 3 specific days seemed to hold, more concentrated than almost anything else in her long life, the particular feeling of being fully, vividly present, husband and children and strangers all gathered together inside something larger than any of them, something that asked real things of her and gave real things back in return. Henry's own children, in time, heard the story of the crossing told and retold at family gatherings until it had taken on the particular polished, slightly exaggerated shape that family stories always eventually acquire. The drop grew steeper with each telling, the stars grew more numerous, the mule Henry had been allowed to lead grew, in some later versions, considerably larger and considerably more dangerous than the gentle, broad-chested animal Pierre had actually handed him the lead rope of. This is simply what happens to stories, told with love across enough dinner tables and enough decades. And Margaret, on the rare occasions she was present to hear one of these embellished versions told by her own son to his own children, apparently never once corrected the exaggerations, content, it seems, to let the story grow into whatever shape her family needed it to hold. Charlotte's path took her, eventually further from the conventional expectations her class and her era had set out for her than Margaret could have confidently predicted on that mountain in 1786. Though perhaps she suspected something of it even then, watching her 15-year-old daughter's face come alive over a scholar's careful answer to an unguarded question. Charlotte never married, choosing instead a life organized largely around correspondence and study, and, eventually, a small but genuinely respected circle of naturalists and scholars across several countries who valued her observations and her careful, patient attention to detail, rather more than the wider society of her time would likely have valued a woman's contributions to such fields. She kept, throughout her long life, the scholar's original letter from the hospice, the one that had started the whole correspondence, tucked into the same book she had been reading in the carriage on the road to Milan, worn soft at the folds from decades of handling. Whether any of this counts, in the grand ledger of history, as a significant outcome of one family's crossing of the Alps in the late summer of 1786, I genuinely do not know, and I am not sure it matters very much whether it does. What I find myself drawn to, telling you this story tonight, is simply the shape of it. Ordinary people, tested by an extraordinary landscape, changed in small, quiet, largely unrecorded ways by 3 days spent trusting strangers with their safety and their comfort, 3 days that none of the guidebooks Edmund carried in his coat pocket could have properly prepared any of them for, because no guidebook can really prepare a person for the specific, individual experience of being carried across a mountain by 4 men whose names you have only just learnt, singing softly to keep their own pace, entirely unbothered by the enormous trust being placed in their shoulders. There is something particular about the way this kind of journey has settled into cultural memory over the centuries since Margaret's crossing, a pattern I want to sit with for a moment before we let her story rest entirely. The Grand Tour itself, as an institution, gradually faded through the 1800s, undone partly by exactly the road building and railway construction we mentioned earlier, which made continental travel faster and considerably less exclusive, available to a far wider range of people than the wealthy young gentlemen and their families who had once treated it as an essential, expensive rite of passage. What had been in Margaret's era a demanding, occasionally uncomfortable undertaking requiring months of careful planning and genuine physical endurance became, within a couple of generations, something closer to an ordinary holiday, accessible by train and later by motorcar, to a middle class that Margaret's own social circle would scarcely have recognized as capable of such travel at all. And yet something of the original experience, the specific texture of trusting strangers with your safety on unfamiliar ground, the particular vulnerability of being carried, quite literally, across a landscape too demanding for your own ordinary means, never entirely disappeared, even as its specific form did. Every generation of travellers since Margaret's has found its own version of that same surrender, whether crossing an ocean by ship, or a desert by camel and guide, or simply handing yourself over to a driver in an unfamiliar city whose language you do not speak, trusting that they will get you safely where you need to go. The mountain crossing the Ashworths made in 1786 is, in that sense, less a relic of a vanished world than an early, particularly vivid example of something travellers have kept doing, in one form or another, for as long as travel itself has existed. The necessary, sometimes frightening, often quietly moving act of putting yourself in the care of people you barely know, because the destination on the other side matters enough to justify the risk. I think there is a reason stories like this one continue to resonate, centuries after the specific details. The chairs, the mule bells, the hospice fires, have become genuinely unfamiliar to almost everyone who hears them. It is not really the historical particulars that hold our attention, interesting as those are in their own right. It is the shape underneath them, the universal, recognizable experience of setting out towards something uncertain, encountering along the way both the kindness and the plain professional competence of strangers, and arriving on the other side changed in ways you did not entirely anticipate when you first packed your trunk. Margaret Ashworth could not have known, folding that shawl for the third time in a rented Geneva house on the last evening of August, exactly what those 3 days would come to mean to her, how often she would return to them in memory across the following 5 decades of her life. Most of us, setting out on whatever our own version of that mountain happens to be, rarely know in advance either. And that, I think, might be the quietest, truest thing this whole story has to offer you tonight, lying there in your own particular dark, at the end of your own particular day. You do not always get to know, in advance, which parts of your life will turn out to matter most in the telling of it, years from now, to whoever happens to be listening. Sometimes it is the grand planned occasions, the weddings and the graduations and the trips deliberately chosen for their significance, and sometimes, quite often actually, if Margaret's long life is any guide, it is the 3 uncomfortable, cold, unexpectedly beautiful days you did not fully choose, the ones that simply happened to you on the way to somewhere else, that end up holding, decades later, the most weight of all. Let your breathing slow now, if it has not already, matching itself, if you like, to the particular unhurried rhythm those chairmen kept across 3 long days of carrying, in and out, steady, patient, no need to rush toward anything. There is nowhere else that rhythm needs to take you tonight except further down into sleep, the same way it once carried an English family safely across a mountain range that could have been frightening and instead, through the quiet competence of people whose names history barely bothered to keep, became something closer to wonder. Feel the weight of your own blanket, the way Margaret might have felt the weight of the wool cloak pulled tight against the mountain cold, a simple physical comfort asking nothing of you except that you let it do its work. Feel the particular stillness of your own room, the way she eventually came to feel the stillness of the hospice at night, thick stone walls holding the cold outside, a fire, somewhere, banked low but never quite going out, tended faithfully by hands that expected nothing in return for the tending. If your mind wanders, as minds do at this hour, let it wander toward the mountain rather than away from it. Let it wander toward the sound of a small bell marking a mule's position on a blind curve, clear and irregular, softening now, growing more distant, the way sounds do at the edge of sleep, present one moment and gone the next without any clear line between the two. Let it wander towards starlight, that particular impossible density of it above a hospice roof, thin cold air holding the whole sky, closer than any sky you have properly looked at in longer than you probably realize, close enough to feel, for just a moment, entirely held by something far larger and far older than any single concern currently occupying your evening. Let it wander too, toward the sound of chairmen singing low and unhurried, filling a long task with a rhythm that made the carrying easier, and let that same rhythm, borrowed now, gentle and repetitive and asking nothing of you, carry you the rest of the way towards sleep, the way it once carried a tired, sunburnt, quietly astonished woman named Margaret Ashworth safely across one of the largest physical barriers of her entire life, 3 days at a time, one careful, unhurried step after another, toward a warm fire and a full table and a family, gathered close on the far side of the mountain. You do not need to hold on to any of the details now. The chairs, the chestnut trees, the small carved mule tucked into a desk drawer for 50 years, none of it needs to be remembered precisely, only felt, the way a good story is felt rather than memorized, settling somewhere warm and wordless just beneath the edge of conscious thought, exactly where it belongs at this hour, exactly where it will still be waiting for you, gently, whenever you happen to wake. Before we let this story rest entirely, I want to go back once more, briefly, to the young man Margaret's family passed on the road that first day, the one walking alone with nothing but a bundle over his shoulder, and boots worn considerably harder than any distance from Geneva could account for, because his crossing, though it received barely a paragraph in this telling so far, deserves a little more of our attention than the family's own more comfortable journey has left room for. His name, as it happens, though Margaret never learned it and never had occasion to ask, was Antoine, and he was 22 years old, and he was walking not toward Italy for pleasure or education, but toward a cousin's small workshop near Turin, where a position as an apprentice cabinet maker had been promised to him, provided he could actually arrive to claim it before the position filled with someone else. He had left his own village, considerably poorer than Jean-Baptiste's, nearly 2 weeks earlier, walking the whole distance rather than paying for any carriage or coach, sleeping in barns when a farmer's hospitality extended that far, and twice already on this particular journey, simply beneath whatever shelter a hedgerow or an overhang of rock happened to provide. The crossing of the pass itself represented, for Antoine, not a highlight of an already comfortable journey, but the single most physically demanding stretch of an already demanding 2 weeks, and he approached it with a mixture of calculation and quiet dread that Margaret, absorbed in her own family's comfortable arrangements, never had occasion to notice. He carried in his bundle considerably less food than the mountain crossing typically required, having rationed carefully across the 2 weeks already behind him, and having little confidence in exactly how much further money he could reasonably stretch. He walked the ascent at his own steady, careful pace, resting when his lungs genuinely demanded it, rather than when convenience allowed, and reached the hospice on the second night, not because any schedule required it, but because his body, by that point, required it considerably more urgently than Margaret's own had. That soup he was served, the same plain, generous soup Margaret found so satisfying after her own 2 comfortable days, meant something rather different to Antoine, a genuine, significant relief after nearly 2 weeks of careful, anxious rationing, and he ate it, Margaret might have noticed had she been watching closely enough, with a particular focused gratitude that had nothing performative in it at all. He slept that night on the same bench near the fire that he had claimed the evening before, grateful simply for the fire's proximity, and set out again before dawn the next morning, well ahead of the Ashworths' own more leisurely start, determined to reach Turin with at least a day to spare before he needed to present himself at his cousin's workshop. He made it, as it turns out, arriving in Turin 2 full days before the Ashworths themselves rolled through the city gates, and secured the apprenticeship he had walked nearly 3 weeks to claim, and went on, over the following decade, to build a genuinely respected career as a cabinet maker in his own right, eventually opening a small workshop of his own, not far from where his cousins had stood, married with children of his own by his early 30s, a life built, quite literally, step by careful step, across a mountain that a wealthier family crossed in comparative comfort at almost exactly the same time, on almost exactly the same ground, carrying almost exactly the same hopes for what waited on the other side. The merchant Margaret's family, passed on that first afternoon, deserves a little more of his own story too, since his particular relationship with the mountain was different again from either the Ashworths or Antoine's. Neither a rare adventure nor a desperate necessity, but simply, plainly, his ordinary working life, repeated so many times that the wonder Margaret felt at every turn had long since worn down, for him, into something closer to habit. His name was Fournier, and he had been making this specific crossing, in one direction or another, for nearly 15 years by the time his path briefly overlapped with the Ashworths, dealing primarily in fine cloth, and, increasingly in recent seasons, in the delicate glassware that Chiron's workshops had become known for, across a fairly wide stretch of Europe. Fournier's relationship with Jean-Baptiste and the other guides was rather different from a typical traveller's too, built across years of repeat business into something closer to genuine friendship, or at least a professional camaraderie that came with its own particular rituals, favours exchanged, news carried between villages that the guides otherwise might not hear for weeks, a standing arrangement about which mules Fournier preferred for his more fragile cargo, and which inn kept the best account of his standing credit when his own coin ran short mid-crossing, as it occasionally did in a difficult trading season. He knew, in a way Margaret's family never had occasion to learn in their single crossing, exactly which turns in the path tended to ice first in early autumn, exactly which innkeeper's wife made the best bread along the whole route, exactly how many days' delay a heavy spring snowmelt typically added to the journey in a wet year. He had a wife back in Lyon, and 3 children, the eldest of whom had recently begun accompanying him on alternating trips. Learning the trade the same patient, apprenticed way Pierre was learning the guiding trade, watching his father negotiate prices and manage the particular logistics of moving fragile goods safely across genuinely difficult terrain. Fournier thought of the mountain, if he thought of it at all in any conscious sense, the way a farmer thinks of a familiar, demanding field, respected rather than marvelled at, a known quantity requiring careful, practiced attention rather than a source of any particular wonder, though even he, on certain especially clear mornings, admitted to a fellow traveller once over supper, would sometimes catch himself simply stopping for a moment, part-way up a familiar slope, struck freshly, despite 15 years of familiarity, by some particular quality of light on the peaks that his usual business-like focus had somehow never quite managed to fully dull. That admission, overheard second-hand, and passed along through exactly the kind of casual traveller's gossip that filled every inn table along this route, stayed with more than one listener longer than either the Ashworth's polished wonder or Antoine's grim determination, this quiet evidence that even a man who had crossed this same demanding ground dozens upon dozens of times, purely as a matter of ordinary business, had never entirely lost the capacity to be surprised by it, however rarely he let that surprise show. The broad, unhurried innkeeper who greeted them all on that first evening, the woman whose name Margaret eventually learned over the course of that single overnight stay, was Colette, had run that particular inn for nearly 20 years by the time the Ashworths passed through her door, having inherited it from her own mother, who had run it for perhaps 25 years before that, a continuity of ownership and practice that meant the building itself, low and thick-walled and built for weather considerably harsher than the mild late August evening Margaret experienced, had been receiving travellers of every description for the better part of half a century under the steady management of essentially the same family. Colette had married young, lost her husband to a fever some 11 years back, and had simply continued running the inn alone afterward with the same brisk, unfussy competence Margaret noticed at supper, raising 2 children of her own in the rooms above the kitchen, both of them now grown, and one of them, her daughter, already beginning to take over more and more of the inn's daily management, learning the trade the same way Pierre and Fournier's son were learning theirs, through steady, patient presence rather than any formal instruction. Colette knew, in the particular way that innkeepers along a well-travelled route come to know things, a great deal about the rhythms of the crossing that no traveller passing through only once could ever properly grasp, which weeks brought the heaviest traffic, which guides could be trusted to settle accounts fairly, which travellers, over the years, had returned more than once and were worth remembering by name. She had fed, by her own rough estimate offered once to a curious guest who asked, somewhere in the neighbourhood of 100 travellers a week during the height of the season, a figure that meant she had likely served, across 2 decades of running the inn, something well into the tens of thousands of meals to travellers of every possible description, wealthy families and poor apprentices, merchants and scholars, soldiers on official business and, occasionally though rarely, travellers whose purposes she judged wise not to inquire too closely into. None of this had made her cynical, as far as Margaret could tell across a single evening's acquaintance, only practical, a woman who had simply seen enough of the world pass through her particular doorway to have developed a settled, unhurried confidence about how to meet nearly any situation a traveller might present her with. I think about Colette rather often, actually, more than her brief appearance in this story might suggest she deserves, because there is something in her particular kind of quiet, sustained competence, one woman running one inn for 2 decades, feeding tens of thousands of travellers she would mostly never see again, that strikes me as its own genuine form of achievement, unrecorded in any history book, unremarked upon by any of the guidebooks that sent English families like the Ashworths through her door, and yet entirely essential to the whole functioning of the crossing, every bit as essential, in her own way, as Jean-Baptiste's guiding, or the monk's fire, or the chairman's careful, practised strength. The older monk who led the family through to the long-warmed room at the hospice, the one with the permanently wind-burned face that spoke of decades spent at that particular altitude, had come to that life by a path considerably less direct than a young man simply choosing a religious vocation in the ordinary way. Brother Anselm, as he was known there, had spent the first half of his adult life as a soldier, a fact he mentioned only rarely, and only when a conversation happened to turn toward it naturally, and had arrived at the hospice initially not as a monk at all, but as an injured traveller himself, caught in an early unexpected autumn storm some 20 years before, nursed back to health by the monks then in residence, and had simply never quite managed to leave afterward, the debt of that particular rescue settling into something that eventually became a vocation rather than a delayed departure. He understood, in a way few of the hospice's other residents fully could, exactly what it meant to arrive at that door genuinely frightened, genuinely uncertain whether the mountain intended to let you through or not, and it was this understanding, more than any formal theological training, that shaped the particular quality of welcome he offered to every traveller who came through afterward, wealthy or poor, confident or terrified, a welcome built less on ceremony than on the plain, hard-won knowledge of exactly how much a warm room and a bowl of soup can mean to a person who has spent the day genuinely afraid of the cold. In a small private ritual nobody else at the hospice quite shared, he kept a habit of stepping outside briefly each night before sleep, regardless of weather, simply to look up at the same density of stars that had so moved Margaret on her own night there, a habit he had maintained, by his own account, every single night for nearly 20 years, through storms and clear skies alike, a small private discipline of attention that had nothing to do with his religious duties and everything to do with a soldier-turned-monk's particular, hard-earned appreciation for simply still being alive to see it. Margaret never learnt any of this about Brother Anselm, of course her single evening's acquaintance offering nothing more than a brief kind welcome and a bowl of soup ladled with practised generosity, but I find myself wanting to offer it to you now, this small unfinished portrait of a man whose whole quiet, patient life was built around exactly the kind of care that made Margaret's crossing, and Antoine's, and Fournier's, and countless other travellers' crossings across those same 20 years, safer and warmer and considerably less frightening than they otherwise might have been, a man whose name appears in no history of the Grand Tour, whose particular quiet ritual of nightly stargazing nobody else ever thought important enough to record, and who nonetheless, in his own unremarked way, held open a small essential door in the middle of an enormous, indifferent mountain range for 20 straight years, letting whoever needed it come in out of the cold. Pierre himself, the 16-year-old who let Henry lead a mule and traded jokes with Mark about the weight of Edmund's trunk, went on, as guides who knew his family had predicted, to lead crossings of his own within another 3 years, eventually taking over the greater share of Jean-Baptiste's regular clients as the older man's own knees, worn down by 3 decades of steady mountain work, began to demand a somewhat gentler pace. Pierre never lost the particular easy warmth Margaret noticed in him that first afternoon, and it became, over the following years, something of a small reputation among the families who made the crossing regularly, that the young guide with the quick laugh had a gift for putting nervous children at ease, a gift he had, without quite realizing it, first properly practiced on an 11-year-old English boy named Henry Ashworth on a bright afternoon in the last days of August, 1786. He married, in his early 20s, a young woman from a village on the Italian side of the pass, a match that meant in its own small way that his own children would grow up moving between 2 languages and 2 cultures with the same easy fluency Pierre himself had developed across years of guiding travellers from both directions, a fluency that had nothing to do with formal schooling and everything to do with simply spending enough seasons listening carefully to whoever happened to be walking beside him. He kept, for the rest of his working life, a small collection of mementos travellers had pressed on him over the years, a coin from a Genevan banker, a carved wooden figure from a Dutch merchant, and, tucked carefully into a small tin box he showed almost nobody, a tiny wooden mule not unlike the one Henry had bought at the market that second afternoon, a gift, as it happens, from Henry himself, pressed into Pierre's hand at the moment of their parting with the shy, wordless earnestness particular to 11-year-old boys who have found, briefly, a friend they do not yet have the vocabulary to properly thank. The 2 young art students Margaret's family met at the second inn. Mr. Pierce and his companions continued on their own considerably less encumbered version of the tour, sketching their way through Turin and further south over the following months, and Mr. Pierce in particular went on, some years later, to a modest but genuine reputation as a landscape painter back in England, specializing as it happens almost entirely in mountain scenes, a body of work that art historians researching his career generations later would trace, with some interest, back to a formative crossing made in his early 20s, the exact crossing, though none of those later researchers could have possibly known it, that briefly, cheerfully, shared an inn table and a bottle of decent wine with the Ashworth family on a mild evening in early September, 1786. All of these lives, Margaret's and Edmund's and Charlotte's and Henry's, Jean-Baptiste's and Pierre's and Mark's, Colette's and Brother Anselm's, Antoine's and Fournier's and young Mr. Pierce's, moved on afterward in their own separate directions, most of them never crossing paths again, most of them entirely unaware of how the others' stories eventually unfolded, and yet for one single overlapping stretch of 3 or 4 days, at the end of one particular August, on one particular stretch of mountain, all of their separate lives briefly, quietly, touched each other, shared a fire, shared a table, shared the same cold air and the same impossible stars, before scattering again, each carrying forward some small, largely unspoken piece of what that shared crossing had given them. There is a particular kind of company found only among strangers, thrown together briefly by circumstance rather than by choice, and I think that is in the end the truest subject of everything we have spent this evening exploring together, more than the mountain itself, more than the specific historical details of chairs and mules and disassembled carriages. It is the company of that long table at Colette's inn, genty and merchant and solitary apprentice sharing the same fire without any of them quite remarking on how unusual that sharing would have felt anywhere else in their ordinary lives. It is the company of the hospice, scholars and family, and a tired young walker, all warmed by the same fire that Brother Anselm had tended faithfully for 2 decades. It is the particular temporary intimacy that difficult shared terrain creates among people who would otherwise have had no occasion to ever sit at the same table together. We do not often get handed circumstances quite so dramatic in our ordinary lives. Most of us, no actual mountain range standing between us and where we need to be, no actual chairmen required to carry us across genuine physical danger, and yet I wonder, sometimes, whether we do not occasionally encounter smaller versions of that same experience anyway, a delayed flight that puts you briefly, unexpectedly, in real conversation with a stranger you would never otherwise have spoken to, a difficult project at work that binds together colleagues who might not have chosen each other's company under easier circumstances, a hard season in life, any hard season, that reveals, if you are lucky, an unexpected generosity in people you barely knew before it started. The mountain, in that sense, is not really so distant from ordinary experience as its dramatic scale might suggest. It is simply a particularly vivid, particularly concentrated version of something most of us encounter, in smaller doses, more often than we tend to notice. Margaret Ashworth, I think, understood some version of this by the time she died. An old woman surrounded by children and grandchildren in a house not so different from the one she had left for 14 months in 1785, a small carved mule, still tucked into a drawer of her writing desk, a story about chairmen singing, and a night of unexplained tears still occasionally told, in her own careful, understated way, to whichever grandchild happened to catch her in the right mood by the fire. She never crossed those particular mountains again, as far as any surviving family record suggests, the one crossing apparently sufficient, somehow, to hold whatever it needed to hold for the rest of a genuinely long and, by most measures, genuinely happy life. There were, and I want to mention this before we let this whole story finally settle, several different routes across the Alps that a family in the Ashworths' position might have chosen, each with its own particular character, its own particular difficulties, its own particular reputation among the guidebooks and the returning travellers whose second-hand advice shaped so much of how families like theirs planned this stage of the journey. Some routes were shorter but steeper, demanding more of the chairman and offering in exchange a faster crossing for families eager to reach Italy with minimal delay. Others were longer but gentler, favoured by families travelling with very young children or with members whose health made a more gradual ascent the wiser choice. The specific pass Margaret's family crossed had been chosen, months earlier, based largely on the recommendation of the very friend whose letters had first described the crossing to her, a recommendation weighed carefully against several others before Edmund finally settled the itinerary. The costs involved were not insignificant, though a family of the Ashworths' means could absorb them without particular strain. 4 bearers per chair, engaged for the full 2 to 3 days of the crossing, represented a meaningful expense, as did the hire of sufficient mules to carry the disassembled carriage and the family's trunks, and the accommodation at each stop along the way, modest as it was by comparison with their usual lodgings. A gentleman's guidebook of the period might list these costs with the same unromantic specificity it applied to currency exchange rates, or the price of cathedral admission, a practical accounting that sat rather oddly, Margaret sometimes thought, alongside the guidebook's more purple descriptions of the scenery those same coins were paying to be carried safely through. Poorer travellers, of course, Antoine chief among the examples this particular story has offered you tonight, simply did without most of these arrangements entirely, trading money they did not have for time and physical endurance they were, out of necessity, willing to spend instead. That negotiation itself, the actual moment of settling terms with Jean-Baptiste and his fellow guides, had taken place not in Geneva, but at that first posting station where the road ran out and the carriage first came apart. A brief, business-like exchange, conducted mostly in French between Edmund and the lead guide, the kind of transaction that appears nowhere in the polished letters families sent home afterward, but that shaped, in entirely practical terms, every hour of comfort or discomfort the following 3 days would hold. Edmund, by his own admission to Margaret afterward, had felt faintly uncertain during that negotiation, aware that he was operating well outside his usual competence, a country gentleman accustomed to managing tenant farms and household accounts, suddenly required to judge, on the spot, in an unfamiliar language, whether a stranger's price for carrying his family safely across a mountain was fair. He had in the end simply trusted the friend's earlier recommendation and Jean-Baptiste's own calm, unhurried manner, a trust that the following 3 days would prove, in every particular, entirely well placed. I mention all of this not because the specific costs or negotiations matter very much in themselves, but because I think there is something quietly moving in the plain, unglamorous machinery beneath even the most beautiful and memorable parts of any journey, the coins changing hands, the terms quietly settled, the practical calculations that had to happen before any of the wonder Margaret experienced over the following days could safely occur at all. Wonder, it turns out, usually rests on a foundation of careful, unremarked practicality, someone negotiating a fair price, someone counting mules, someone deciding which chair goes to which traveller based on a dozen small judgments nobody writes down. The mountain gave Margaret her stars and her tears and her son's delighted small carved mule, yes, but it gave her all of that only after Edmund had first managed, however uncertainly, the far less romantic business of making sure 4 capable men and enough sturdy mules were properly engaged for the work ahead. There is one more small scene I want to leave you with before we finally close the door on this particular evening, one that happened not on the mountain itself but a full week later, well south of Turin, on an ordinary evening in a lodging house in a town whose name barely matters for our purposes here. Margaret, unpacking a trunk in search of a shawl she had misplaced somewhere in the general reshuffling of belongings that comes with weeks of continuous travel, came upon the small wool-wrapped bundle containing her mother's portrait, the same bundle that had travelled the whole crossing strapped to the back of a mule she never learnt the name of, and found herself sitting quietly on the edge of the bed for several minutes, simply holding it, unopened, in her lap. She had checked at the time that it survived the crossing intact, a brief, practical confirmation made in the yard where the carriage was reassembled, relief registered, and then set aside in the general business of resettling into the carriage and continuing the journey. But this quieter moment, a week later, in an ordinary room with nothing urgent demanding her attention, allowed something different to surface, a fuller, slower recognition of what it had actually meant to trust that particular object, one of the few physical remnants of a mother 6 years gone, to the shoulders of strangers on a genuinely difficult mountain path. She unwrapped it slowly, checked the small painted face for any damage the wool had not fully prevented, found none, and sat looking at it for a while longer than the task strictly required, her own face, in the room's dim evening light, doing something complicated that nobody else happened to be present to witness. This is not a dramatic moment. As these things go, no danger involved, no revelation, simply a woman sitting quietly with an old grief and an old photograph, or rather an old portrait, in a rented room a week after a mountain crossing that had, in its own indirect way, brought both a little closer to the surface than they had been in some time. But I find myself drawn to it anyway, this small, private, entirely unremarkable scene, because it strikes me as a fair representation of how most real emotional processing actually happens in an ordinary life, not in grand cinematic moments, but in these quiet, delayed, almost accidental instances, a trunk unpacked in search of something else entirely, an old object rediscovered, a few minutes of stillness that a person did not plan for and might not even fully recognize in the moment as significant. Margaret rewrapped the portrait carefully afterward, tucked it back into the same trunk, found the shawl she had actually been looking for, and went down to join her family for supper, her face, by the time she reached the dining room, giving away nothing at all of the quiet several minutes that had just passed upstairs. Edmund noticed nothing unusual, Charlotte noticed nothing unusual, only Henry, briefly, asked why his mother's eyes looked a little pink, a question Margaret answered with a small, practiced smile and a comment about the dust from the road, an answer Henry accepted without further question, and that Margaret herself, writing about the evening much later in a private journal her family would not discover until well after her death, admitted had not been entirely true. There is one more small detail I want to share, saved for last because it seems, in its own quiet way, to gather up nearly everything else this story has been circling around tonight. Some years after Margaret's crossing, long after Henry had grown into his own settled adult life, and Charlotte had built her own quiet, unconventional path through correspondence and study, a chance encounter brought word back to the family, second-hand, through a mutual acquaintance who had made the same crossing decades later and happened to mention, in an entirely unrelated conversation, a guide he had used named Pierre, well into middle age by then, still working the pass, still known among regular travellers for his particular gift with nervous children. The acquaintance had not known, of course, of any connection to the Ashworths specifically, simply mentioning the guide's name in passing as part of an ordinary travel anecdote. and it was only when the story reached Henry, by then a grown man with children of his own, that the name registered, and he realized, with a small private jolt of recognition, that the boy who had once let him lead a mule across a mountain path was still there, decades later, still doing exactly the same essential, unglamorous essential work, still, presumably, letting other frightened or delighted children take the lead rope of some gentle mule for a few proud, memorable minutes of their own crossing. Henry wrote a letter, as it happens, care of the inn where the family had stayed on that first night, uncertain whether it would ever actually reach its intended recipient, given how many years had passed, and how uncertain the postal arrangements of that particular mountain region remained even decades later. Whether Pierre ever received it, whether he remembered the 11-year-old English boy who had once been so thoroughly delighted by a mule and a spare length of rope, family record does not preserve. The letter itself, along with whatever reply it might or might not have received, lost somewhere in the general scattering of papers that happens to most families across enough generations. But the fact of its sending, Henry's own quiet decision, well into his own middle age, to reach back across several decades and thank a man he had known for barely 2 days as a child, strikes me as its own small, complete answer to the question this whole evening has been circling, about what actually stays with us from a journey like this one, and about which of the people we meet along any difficult road end up, quietly, mattering rather more than the itinerary ever suggested they would. I think that is where I want to leave this particular story, not with the mountain itself, vast and patient and indifferent as it remains, but with that letter, written decades later, addressed uncertainly to an inn that may or may not still have stood by then, carrying nothing more urgent than one grown man's quiet, persistent gratitude toward a boy who had once, briefly, made a difficult crossing feel like an adventure rather than an ordeal. Most of the people who help us across our own difficult stretches of ground never receive that kind of letter. Most of us, if we are honest, never quite manage to send one either. The gratitude felt deeply enough at the time, but somehow never translated into the actual, deliberate act of reaching back across the years to say so. Henry did. And I find, turning that small fact over one last time before we finally let this whole evening rest, that I admire him for it rather more than I admire anything else in this entire long story. One last image, before we truly let the mountain rest for tonight. Picture the disassembled carriage itself, that first afternoon, wheels wrapped carefully in cloth and strapped across a mule's broad back, and consider how strange an object it must have looked to anyone who had never seen a carriage taken apart before, a familiar shape rendered suddenly unfamiliar, its purpose only recognizable in pieces rather than as a whole. There is something in that image I keep returning to, the idea that even the most solid, dependable things in our lives, the vehicles that carry us forward, the routines we lean on, can be broken down, carried across difficult ground in careful pieces, and put back together again on the other side, whole, functional, ready to carry us onward exactly as before, perhaps even a little more trusted for having survived the taking apart. Margaret's family did not know, watching those wheels wrapped and loaded that first afternoon, that the carriage would be waiting for them intact 3 days later, exactly where Jean-Baptiste promised it would be, reassembled by hands they never saw at work. They simply had to trust it, the way travellers on difficult roads have always had to trust the people and processes that carry them through the parts of a journey they cannot manage alone. And when the carriage did appear again, solid and whole at the far side of the pass, there was no ceremony to it, no announcement, simply a practical, competent restoration of something that had briefly needed to come apart in order to go forward at all. I think there is a quiet comfort in that image for anyone listening tonight who happens to be moving through their own difficult stretch of ground, whatever shape that stretch happens to take. Sometimes the things that carry us do need to come apart for a while, disassembled, redistributed, carried forward in careful, separate pieces by people and processes we cannot always see clearly from where we are standing. And sometimes, if we are patient, if we trust the people doing that careful work, those things do come back together again on the other side, whole enough, sturdy enough, ready to carry us onward into whatever comes next. The chairmen, too, deserve one final image before we close this evening properly. Picture them at the very end of the Ashworths' 3 days, paid, thanked, already turning back up the mountain toward the next family waiting somewhere behind, their shoulders already anticipating tomorrow's weight, their feet already finding tomorrow's familiar rhythm on ground they have walked more times than they could ever properly count. There is no grand farewell in this image, no lingering sentiment, simply four men returning to work that will continue, season after season, family after family, long after the specific weight of Margaret Ashworth's particular chair has been forgotten by everyone except, perhaps, Margaret herself, who carried the memory of their careful, steady shoulders with her for the rest of her long life. Consider, too, the particular sound the mountain made at different hours across those 3 days, since sound, more than almost anything else, has a way of settling into memory long after specific sights have blurred. The sharp, ringing clarity of a chairman's call across thin morning air, the soft, irregular percussion of hooves finding their footing on loose stone, the low, unhurried murmur of guides discussing the day's route in a language Margaret only partially understood, punctuated by the occasional laugh that needed no translation at all. The particular hush of the hospice at night, thick stone walls swallowing sound rather than merely lacking it, and beneath all of it always, that same continuous note of wind moving across bare rock, patient and constant, the closest thing the mountain had to a single unbroken voice of its own. Margaret would find herself, years later, in the ordinary quiet of an English evening, catching some faint echo of one of these sounds in an entirely unrelated context, a particular quality of wind against her own window on a stormy night, a distant bell that briefly, disorientingly, recalled the small bell tied around the lid mule's neck, and she would pause, just for a moment, caught somewhere between her actual surroundings and the mountain she had crossed decades before the moment passed and ordinary life resumed its ordinary shape around her. This is, I think, simply what memory does with the sounds that mattered to us once, tucking them away somewhere just beneath conscious recall, ready to surface unbidden whenever some small accidental echo calls them back. And so, carrying all of that with you now, the sounds and the sights and the small, quiet lives we have spent this evening gathering together, patient guides and unglamorous mules, a grieving mother made briefly unexpectedly whole beneath an impossible density of stars, a young apprentice walking his own hard road toward his own hard-won future, a monk who never stopped looking up. Let it all settle now, gently, the way snow settles on a mountain that has already seen so many winters it has long since lost any need to count them. One more small thing, before we let it all rest completely. Think of the particular weight of a well-worn wooden pole settling onto a shoulder that has carried it 1,000 times before. The exact spot on the wood polished smooth by exactly that shoulder, exactly that pressure, repeated so often it has stopped feeling like weight at all, and become instead something closer to balance, something closer to home. There is a version of that same settling happening in your own body right now, if you let it. Your own weight finding its own familiar place against the mattress, the pillow, the particular curve of the bed that already knows the shape of you, worn smooth by however many nights you have rested here before tonight. You do not need to carry anything else. You do not need to climb anything else. You have already arrived, and the ground beneath you, patient and steady as any well-trodden mountain path, is exactly where it needs to be. There is one last small comparison I want to leave you with, one that occurred to me only after everything else in this story had already settled into place. A crossing like the one you have spent this evening making, alongside Margaret and Edmund and Charlotte and Henry, is not so different, in its basic shape, from the crossing you make every single night on your way towards sleep, an ordinary threshold that nonetheless asks something real of you, a willingness to let go of the familiar ground of your waking day and trust that something steady and competent, whether you call it your own tired body or simply the patient, ordinary mechanics of rest, will carry you safely across to the other side. You do not need guides for this crossing. You do not need chairs or mules or a hospice fire. You only need to let your weight settle, let your breathing slow, and trust, the way Margaret eventually learned to trust four strangers' careful shoulders, that you will arrive gently on the far side of tonight, rested and whole and ready for whatever tomorrow happens to bring. Think, if you like, of the innkeepers you have never met who are, tonight, somewhere in the world, tending a fire for a traveller you will never know, and feel, if only for a moment, a small quiet kinship with all of them, all the patient, unremarked people across all of history who have simply kept the warmth going for whoever happened to need it next. That is a kind thought to fall asleep on. It is, I think, the kindest thought this whole story has to offer. Let the last image of the evening simply be firelight, low and steady, somewhere on a mountainside that does not need you to remember its name, warming a room that has warmed 1,000 tired travellers before you, and will warm 1,000 more after, none of them in any particular hurry, none of them needing to be anywhere else at all. And if, somewhere in all of this, you have already drifted past the point of following the words closely, that is exactly as it should be. The story has done its work the moment your attention started to loosen its grip, the moment following along stopped feeling necessary and simply listening, half awake, became enough. There is no test at the end of this, nothing to recall in the morning, nothing to prove you are paying attention. The mountain does not check whether you followed every guide's name or every turn of the path. It only asks, the way it has always asked of every traveller who ever crossed it, that you arrive, eventually, safely, on the other side, however you manage to get there. Rest easy tonight. Whatever mountain your own day happened to place in front of you, however steep it felt, however far the path seemed to stretch, you crossed it. You are here now, safe, warm, on the far side of it, and that is really all that ever needed to happen. Let the mountain go quiet now, and let the room around you go quiet with it, one following the other the way night always follows day, unhurried, certain, needing nothing from you but the willingness to let it happen. Good night, traveller. The path behind you is done with you now, and the one ahead belongs entirely to tomorrow. Whatever weight you carried into tonight, set it down now, gently, the way a chairman finally sets down a chair at the end of a long day's climb, unhurried, careful, done. There is nothing waiting for you now but rest, plain and simple, the same rest that met Margaret at the end of every long day on that mountain, earned, quiet, entirely deserved. Sleep now. The mountain will still be there tomorrow, patient as ever, and so, quite happily, will I. Close your eyes, if they are not closed already, and let the rest of it go. Nothing more is asked of you tonight, traveller, nothing at all. Just the dark now, and the quiet, and whatever gentle, unhurried thing sleep decides to carry you toward next. Rest well, and I will see you again soon. There is nothing left now but the quiet, and the dark, and whatever gentle dream happens to be waiting on the other side of it. Sleep now, gently, and let the whole of it go, the mountain behind you, the warmth ahead, nothing left to carry but yourself. So let us come back, now one final time, to where we began this evening, to you, wherever you happen to be listening from tonight, Ohio or Manchester or somewhere along the Queensland coast, or any of the 100 other places this story has quietly travelled to reach you. The mountain Margaret crossed is still there, of course, essentially unchanged by 2.5 centuries of continued human traffic, still cold at its higher elevations even in the height of summer, still holding that same impossible density of stars on a clear night, still entirely indifferent to whichever particular travellers happen to be crossing it in any given generation. The roads have changed, the travellers have changed, the mountain has not. I like to think, if it means anything at all, that some small trace of every person who ever crossed that pass carrying real feeling with them, wonder, or fear, or grief, or simple exhausted gratitude, remains somehow folded into the place itself, not in any literal sense. I do not mean to suggest anything mystical by it, but in the sense that a place shaped so thoroughly by centuries of human passage carries something of all that passage forward, layered invisibly beneath whatever a modern traveller happens to notice on their own crossing. Margaret's tears outside the hospice door, Antoine's careful, anxious rationing, Fournier's rare, unguarded moment of surprise at familiar light on familiar peaks, Colette's 20 years of steady, unremarked welcome, Brother Anselm's nightly ritual of simply looking up, none of it recorded anywhere official, and all of it, somehow, still there, in the way a much-loved room seems to hold something of everyone who ever sat quietly inside it. Your own evening tonight, whatever shape it has taken, Whatever brought you here to listen rather than to sleep straight away is doing something similar in its own small way, adding its own quiet layer to whatever place you happen to be lying in right now, a bedroom that has held countless other nights before this one and will hold countless more after it, most of them forgotten, a few of them perhaps mattering rather more than you currently realize. The way Margaret's mountain crossing mattered rather more to her than any of the grander, more deliberately significant occasions the rest of her long tour so carefully arranged. You do not need to do anything with any of this tonight. You do not need to hold on to the details, or draw any particular lesson from Margaret's crossing, or even remember, by morning, most of what we have spent this evening exploring together. All you need to do, right now, is exactly what you are already doing. Lying still, breathing slow, letting the accumulated weight of your own day settle somewhere it can finally rest. Let the mountain hold itself, patient and enormous and entirely unbothered, the way it always has. Let Margaret's story rest too, complete now, told, its small private grief and its small private joy both equally allowed to simply exist without needing anything further from you. Somewhere, right now, if you like to imagine it this way, a fire is banked low in a stone room built specifically to keep travellers warm, tended by hands that have tended it faithfully for longer than most careers last, waiting, patiently, unhurriedly, for whoever needs it next. You do not need to be that traveller tonight. You have already arrived somewhere warm. The door is already closed gently behind you. There is nothing more to cross, nothing more to carry, nothing more required of you at all, except this, the last small unhurried act of the whole evening, letting your eyes stay closed, letting your breathing continue its own slow, patient rhythm, letting sleep at last do what sleep has always known how to do, quietly, gently, the way it has for every traveller, in every generation, whoever finally reached the far side of whatever mountain they happen to be crossing, and let themselves at last rest. Sleep well. I will be here again tomorrow night with another story whenever you are ready for it. For now, there is nothing left to do but let go.